The guy suddenly wakes up completely startled, breathing heavily, without understanding a single thing about what is going on. Right then, the kid realizes he is in a hospital bed with a bunch of equipment all around him. At that moment, some birds are chirping at the window, and the boy decides to get up to take a look. Looking outside, he sees a giant modern city full of massive buildings that look amazing. Then, the boy stares at his own hands, which are covered in bandages and IV needles. The dark-haired boy becomes thoughtful and deeply confused, trying to figure out where he actually ended up this time. At that exact instant, he notices a very old photo frame on top of the nightstand right next to the bed. When he picks up the object, the young man sees a photo of himself and finally realizes who he truly is. Suddenly, a very strange noise makes the boy freeze in shock, his eyes wide open. He hears slow footsteps approaching the door and immediately prepares himself for whatever trouble might come next. Just then, the doorknob turns and a nurse enters the room, holding a clipboard with medical exam results. But the woman gets a massive scare when she sees that the patient's bed is completely empty. So, she starts searching for the boy while calling out his name very loudly all across the room. At that moment, the young man is seen crouching way up on the ceiling, holding a pen as if it were a weapon. He keeps wondering where he is while preparing to strike that stranger down below. With that, the boy aims the sharp tip of the pen directly at the employee's neck. He hangs upside down from the wall, and the young lady keeps searching without noticing anything wrong. But suddenly, a flash in his mind makes the protagonist remember some eerie things from the past. The story flashes back 500 years in time to a dark forest that is being struck by strange lightning. In this ancient place, a warrior runs incredibly fast through the mountains, moving like a hurricane. The ninja runs while gritting his teeth so hard it looks like they might break at any second. Feeling intense pain, the warrior forces his legs to run even faster through the middle of the forest. Right then, his own muscles begin to tear because of the absurd amount of effort he is putting in. The ninja named Goko runs desperately, hoping and praying that his master is safe and sound. He focuses his exhausted gaze while quietly praying for the life of his beloved master and friend. At that instant, a cold shiver runs through his entire body, indicating that something terrible has happened. Upon getting close to the location, he sees that the great temple is caught in a devastating fire. The massive flames destroy the entire structure while an army of soldiers just stands by and watches. The young warrior is completely shocked and paralyzed to see all that destruction right there. In all this chaos, several flaming arrows fly through the air, striking down many people who were trying to escape. In front of the burning temple, the young man screams desperately for his leader, who is trapped inside. Seeing the true danger, he completely loses his cool and decides to charge forward without thinking about what might happen. At that moment, the fighter unleashes a bizarre green spiritual energy and loses control of his power. This supernatural aura forces his torn muscles to heal so that he can keep moving forward in the fight. He cracks the ground when he lands and rushes toward a strange figure blocking his path. A dark silhouette appears amidst the flames, coldly warning that no one shall pass. The enemy reveals himself as the strongest samurai of all, the powerful opponent from the rival clan. But the protagonist just gives a wild smile, his eyes glowing a vibrant shade of bright blue. The opponent is Ryuga, known for defeating hundreds of men in combat without a single shred of mercy. With that, the ninja activates his maximum power, making his gaze look even more eerie and brilliant. The samurai draws his sword, mocking the situation and promising that he will cut his opponent in two. Just then, the swordsman takes his famous quick-draw stance, preparing for his lethal strike. He delivers a powerful slash at the speed of sound while his opponent charges straight toward him. But the agile ninja dodges effortlessly and advances, preparing a devastating punch with his bare hands. And with a brutal punch, the dark-haired youth shatters his rival's blade, easily destroying his attack. The warrior is so fast that he makes his rival's strike look as slow as a turtle crawling through a fire. The swordsman stands there in disbelief and shock upon seeing his legendary weapon broken by a single fist. At that instant, glowing blue patterns begin to shine on the young man's face, revealing his mark. He lands a devastating kick right to his opponent's face, demonstrating the power of a true force of nature. With that, the legendary ninja soars through the air and finishes off his enemy with an impressive maneuver. At that exact moment, the young man focuses all his strength and activates his most powerful spiritual technique. Then, his rival's lifeless body plummets into the burning ground, and the temple begins to completely collapse. The fighter manages to break into the burning structure and lands on his knees right in the center of the temple. But the dark-haired youth freezes in horror as he sees a silhouette ruined by the fire and pierced by many swords. He realizes that his beloved leader is gravely injured and drawing his final breath right there. At that moment, the young warrior's eyes widen, completely unable to believe the terrible sight. With that, blood pools across the temple floor, confirming the grim reality of their defeat. The ninja screams with all his might in absolute despair for his passing master, but he notices that a mysterious dark silhouette is standing right next to his leader's body. The secret enemy wears dark armor with an eerie mask that has a single glowing red eye. Enraged, the dark-haired youth yells out, demanding to know who the coward responsible for all of this is. Then, the warrior flies toward the villain, launching an aerial strike at maximum speed. He begins to attack relentlessly, delivering a barrage of swift strikes with his sharp and incredibly fast hands. But the masked opponent effortlessly blocks every single hit, sending sparks flying into the air. Right then, each slashing strike made by the hero carries an absurd amount of mystical energy. The strikes are so powerful that they can slice through heavy metal as if it were mere paper. Furthermore, the young man's fists glow intensely, creating a barrier of destructive force. He can destroy even the hardest rocks with the ease of kneading a piece of soft bread. However, the masked warrior extends his arm and stops the dark-haired youth's punch, using only one hand. The boy grates his teeth in anger upon realizing that his strongest strike was stopped so effortlessly. He tries every possible way to rip off his opponent's protection to discover his true face. But the villain takes a massive leap backward and vanishes into the intense flames of that blazing fire. With that, the masked figure lands lightly on top of a burning wooden beam high above everyone. The mysterious rival unfurls an ancient scroll from his hands, revealing a very strange symbol. The dark-haired youth looks up in surprise, realizing that his opponent is about to unleash a secret power. At that moment, the dangerous warrior extends the magical item and gathers a massive amount of spiritual force. He wonders what that paper scroll could be, while bracing himself to face the next spell. Just then, the masked figure quickly brings his hands together, chanting the sacred words of the ancient incantation. A terrifying electrical storm begins to form in the sky in a completely eerie manner. The enemy shifts his finger positions incredibly fast to finalize the ritual of destruction. With that, a bizarre purple energy flows from his arms, completing the powerful spell. A massive bolt of lightning plummets from the heavens and strikes the area with a deafening and violent crash. The impact triggers a massive explosion of flames that quickly consumes everything around it. However, the young man crosses his arms to shield himself from the destructive shockwave ripping through the place. As soon as the dust settles, he realizes that his despised opponent managed to escape without leaving a single trace. The hero screams in rage, calling for the coward to come back and face him head-on like a true warrior. His cries echo in vain throughout the ruined temple, and his heart is filled with an overwhelming sadness. Suddenly, his leader's blood-stained hand moves ever so slowly, trying to get his attention. The fading master begs with his last remaining strength for the young man not to go after that monster. He praises the dark-haired youth's great strength, mentioning that his rival was extremely skilled and dangerous. The Lord of the Lands mentions that the mysterious technique and the rival's tattoos were deeply ominous. At that, the boy cries, clenching his fist tightly out of sheer frustration for failing to save the one he cared about. The man reveals that his life is coming to an end, and that this is officially the sad conclusion of his journey. He deeply regrets not being able to achieve his ultimate goal of uniting the entire nation. At that moment, the passing man remembers his greatest desire, which was to create an era of peace for everyone. He He closes his eyes, whispering about the tranquility he so desperately wanted to leave behind for his beloved people. The young man recalls the times when the two of them would gaze at the beautiful village from high up on the castle balcony. The master would smile happily, dreaming of a bright future without unnecessary wars across the world. But in the present, the warrior weeps bitterly while holding the lifeless body of his beloved mentor. The souls of the fallen leader says goodbye, expressing sadness over not being able to see that beautiful dream come true. The leader's spirit slowly vanishes into the flames as he deeply laments the entire situation. Desperate, the young warrior screams his master's name in vain, feeling a sharp pain in his chest. He stares at the completely lifeless face of his lord amidst the blazing temple fire. At that moment, the structure begins to collapse around the young man, who weeps on his knees right there. With that, the hero decides to end his own life, following the honorable tradition of his people. He grips the handle of his dagger firmly, knowing that this somber fate must be fulfilled. Before departing, the dark-haired youth wonders with a sad smile if true peace actually exists in this world. Looking at the flames, he recalls the endless war where he was never able to see a single sign of tranquility. Yet, his beloved master was always able to see a peaceful tomorrow filled with hope for everyone. Therefore, the brave warrior decides that he will also believe in that beautiful dream as he says his final goodbyes. With that, he makes a silent prayer to be reborn in a peaceful era, free from bloody conflicts. At that exact instant, the young man makes his ultimate sacrifice on the temple floor, fulfilling his vow of loyalty. The story jumps about 500 years into the future, showing the front of a modern hospital. Inside the office, a caring doctor asks the young man to state his name and age once more. The dark-haired youth calmly replies that his name is Hibari. He is 17 years old, and he is just an ordinary student. With that, the doctor smiles, saying his mind is perfectly sound and that he is cleared to go home. He becomes thoughtful as he listens to the professional praise his incredible and miraculous physical recovery. Upon leaving the area, the nurse congratulates him on being discharged and advises him not to overexert himself. As he walks, the young man remembers how he almost attacked that employee out of pure instinct. With that, he sighs in relief, glad that he didn't accidentally hurt anyone at that moment. He walks thoughtfully through the quiet streets and realizes that truly bizarre things can happen in life. In reality, the soul of the ninja from 500 years ago now resides in the body of this young student, but he still perfectly remembers his master's words about living in a world of peace. The young man is absolutely certain that he ended his own life in the burning temple centuries ago. He still doesn't understand how he ended up here after all this time, but he decides to move forward. Suddenly, cheerful laughter catches the boy's attention right in the middle of the sunny sidewalk. With that, he sees a cute little girl playing happily with a gentle puppy right next to her mother. The dark-haired youth watches that simple scene and feels a very warm and comforting sensation in his chest. Because of this, a gentle smile appears on the young man's face as he realizes that true peace really does exist. He thinks to himself that living in this new era envisioned by his ancient master shouldn't be bad at all. However, his quiet thoughts are interrupted by a slight discomfort caused by his new clothes. The young man complains that the school uniform is quite difficult to move around in, and then he hears a shout right behind him. Just then, a large guy with a mean look calls out his name, seeming quite surprised to see him alive. The bully approaches with a laugh, asking in a mocking tone if the kid actually managed to survive. But the hero analyzes his rival coldly, noticing that the big brute is completely wide open. The stranger comes closer with an ironic smile on his face, showing no actual intention to start a fight. So the young man quickly deduces that this guy must be some sort of friend to the body's previous owner. At that moment, the bully shoves the dark-haired youth's head, casually demanding a greeting. The young man tries to remember if this massive guy's name is Kamazawa while enduring the rough play. With that, he offers an amicable smile and greets the large guy in a polite and very calm manner. The guy in the jacket finds it amusing and comments that his classmate became very submissive after the accident. He gets real close, mocking the fact that hitting his head from a massive height completely changed him. Next, the big guy throws his arm around the hero's neck, inviting him to go have some fun at school. The boy reacts with surprise to those words and displays a highly curious and very sharp look. He finds the idea quite interesting, that school is meant precisely for people to have fun and enjoy themselves. In his ancient era of endless battles, the ninja could never even think about having fun or experiencing peace. Thrilled by this, the young man happily accepts the invitation and says he is looking forward to this new journey. The brute cheers excitedly and drags the young man along to the place where they always used to hang out. At that moment, the hero genuinely smiles, as it is the first time he has ever leaned his arm on a friend. He observes the school grounds calmly and concludes that true peace is wonderful. Right then, the bully leans his weight on another terrified student and orders him to clean his shoes. The protagonist observes that entire cruel scene with a completely calm and expressionless look. Then the big guy smokes a cigarette and asks mockingly why the dark-haired youth doesn't lick his boots too. His sidekicks begin to laugh in a malicious way, commenting that the young man used to be real good at obeying. But the boy just stares at the situation in silence, his gaze shifting into a sharp, analytical look. Just then, the gang leader looks angrily at the red-haired boy, who is serving as his human chair in the courtyard. The crazy guy explains with a laugh that he found a new human chair after the dark-haired youth jumped off the roof. With that, the bully grabs his phone and starts telling a terrible story about the red-haired boy's sister. He shows a video where he cowardly mistreats the young lady who had only tried to defend her younger brother. The recording shows the young woman crying and begging for help while the aggressors laugh out loud. The big guy keeps laughing at his phone, saying he took the opportunity to mistreat the young lady even more. Hearing all of that, the poor boy on the ground begins to cry and shake from absolute despair and anguish. The red-haired kid begs through his tears for the guys to leave his family alone and stop everything. But the brute kicks the boy out of annoyance, complaining that he ruined the group's fun with his crying. The mistreated youth desperately apologizes, and the bully yells out that servants aren't supposed to speak. Suddenly, the protagonist approaches in silence and firmly grabs the aggressor's shoulder, startling him. He doesn't understand phones or videos, but he understands very well what it means to be a coward. The young ninja realizes instantly that this big guy is someone who does not belong in a peaceful world. So, he states firmly that there is nothing more pathetic in this world than a coward. The brute gets extremely furious, the veins on his forehead popping upon hearing such audacity. In reality, the dark-haired youth just wanted to put a stop to that malice, with no intention of starting a fight. At that, the bully arrogantly challenges the hero, asking if he forgot who runs things around there. With that, the student takes an imposing step forward and demands that the bully show him. The crazy guy completely loses his temper from sheer rage and readies his punch to destroy the protagonist. This challenge serves as the starting signal for a fight, while the sidekicks mock the hero. The big guy lets out an insane laugh, commenting that his opponent must have forgotten what pain feels like. Then, he cracks his knuckles, promising that he is going to teach the boy a painful lesson. The brute throws a monstrous punch with total force, and his friends celebrate their guaranteed victory. But the dark-haired youth drops his guard for a split second, being far too accustomed to the world's peace. The young hero never expected an aggressor so weak and slow to attack him in that manner. Because of this surprise, the young man's defensive reaction is slightly delayed against that fist. Right then, his warrior reflexes act faster than his own mind, and he strikes back. Just like eyes blink automatically to protect themselves from dust, the ninja's body reacts on its own. This involuntary movement is the result of years of brutal, lethal training in the young man's past. With that, the hero delivers a spectacular flying kick, striking the opponent's face dead on. The precise hit makes the crazy guy spit blood and fly backward in a very painful manner. The big guy is thrown onto the courtyard ground, knocked out instantly by a pure ninja reflex. He crashes hard onto the asphalt, completely unconscious right in front of his astonished gang. But The protagonist panics completely upon realizing what he just did with that strike. He gets startled, thinking that he just took a civilian's life because of his automatic reflex. The young man stares at the body on the ground, deeply relieved to notice that the bully is still breathing. Then the dark-haired youth feels a sharp pain in his hand and looks at his fingers with a worried expression. He notices that his skin is torn and bleeding heavily because of the violent impact of the hit. This happens because his current body belongs to an ordinary boy who cannot handle his ninja techniques. Right then, the sidekicks help their injured leader up, shouting in fear over the state he is in. They lift their companion in a hurry, saying they need to take him to the hospital immediately. The guys back away, carrying their wounded friend while shouting vows of revenge across the courtyard. The boy wipes the blood from his hand, thinking that his old skills are useless in this era. Then he approaches the red-haired kid on the ground, extending his hand and asking if his classmate is okay. But suddenly, a mysterious and very dense white smoke begins to envelop the young man in the courtyard. The dark-haired youth looks on in shock at the red-haired kid, who is kneeling and completely surrounded by the mist. With that, the protagonist shields himself with his arms and realizes that this is a cloning technique. Then the injured boy reveals himself, calmly smoking a cigarette with a highly intimidating look. He steps out from the middle of the smoke screen, displaying a demeanor completely different from before. Because of this, the hero decides to raise his alert status, sensing a lethal intent radiating from him. The orange-haired opponent coldly asks if the dark-haired youth is also a real ninja. At that instant, the young man notices glowing marks on his rival's neck and identifies a tattoo. The youth takes a puff of his cigarette and introduces himself as Hattori, a warrior from the Secret Union. Wearing modern combat gear, he states that he is carrying out his mission in absolute secrecy. With great agility, the red-haired youth grabs his throwing blades and readies himself for the next move. He vows that he will defeat the dark-haired youth no matter what, and assumes a dangerous attack stance. The protagonist is left confused, wondering what this union could be and what their orders are. He analyzes his kneeling adversary, trying to decipher who this strange warrior truly is. Suddenly, the enemy leaps at high speed toward the hero, kicking off a tense battle. Right then, the opponent hurls his special spinning blades, which slice through the air effortlessly. He performs rapid hand signs to conjure a destructive technique using smoke canisters. But the protagonist moves with agility and manages to halt his rival's attack with his bare hands. Several explosions detonate at the exact same time, covering the entire courtyard in a massive white cloud. The red-haired youth takes advantage of the distraction to activate his secret mist prison technique all around. With that, dense currents of smoke begin to encircle the dark-haired youth, trapping him in a snare. The smoke closes in rapidly, leaving the hero with absolutely no way out in the middle of the courtyard. He tries to see through the barrier, wondering why he is suddenly being attacked out of nowhere. Without understanding any of it, the dark-haired youth dodges a swift strike and focuses on finding a way to defend himself. He picks up an iron bar from the ground to block his rival's sharp blade and endure the fight. The hero remains highly alert, noting that his opponent's camouflage ability is spectacular. He remembers that in the past, ninjas used perfect disguises to infiltrate and spy on targets. The ancient warriors knew how to blend into the crowd as ordinary laborers to carry out missions. They could look like weak, harmless people or even trustworthy monks and samurais. Concealing their true intentions, they would blend into the target's life until the perfect moment. Then, the assassins would strike by surprise, eliminating any threat with no chance for defense. The young man realizes that his rival was pretending to be weak and crying just to hide his true strength. He is impressed to note that this young orange-haired kid is a great master of the shadows. Camouflage is the secret foundation of a shinobi, and through it, the dark-haired youth recognizes the guy's high level. The boy wonders if ninjas are still hidden within the modern crowds to this very day. Suddenly, the rival reappears amidst the smoke, delivering a rapid strike and taunting the protagonist. The red-haired youth blows a concentrated gust of wind to destabilize the dark-haired youth's movements. The mist gets into the hero's eyes, obstructing his vision and making the situation much more difficult. Right then, the opponent delivers a precise slash that makes blood gush out, hitting the protagonist's leg. The hero groans in pain from the violent impact of the attack, but stays on his feet to defend himself. He is pushed back by the force of the hit, and the enemy leaps agilely back into the fog. The orange-haired warrior moves with extreme ease through the smoke with a confident smile. He warns that the dark-haired youth will never be able to find him inside that smoke prison. Desperate, the protagonist screams for his rival to stop the fight, as he does not want to fight him. The boy asks his adversary to explain the situation and tell him what is going on there. Then a mysterious voice echoes through the fog, revealing that a terrible danger looms over the city. The warrior claims that there is a highly dangerous serial killer operating in the shadows. He firmly reveals that his true mission is to hunt down this monster and put an end to the deaths. The dark-haired youth tries to concentrate, noting that his opponent managed to completely erase his physical presence. He deduces that this smoke screen is an advanced variation of ancient fire techniques. It is a perfect stealth style for eliminating targets silently in the middle of the darkness. Right then, the red-haired youth accuses the hero of hiding without an official registration, saying that is suspicious. But the dark-haired youth screams back through the smoke, saying he only wants to live a peaceful life. Then, the opponent scoffs at that response, claiming that a true assassin never seeks peace. At that moment, arms made of mist begin to silently emerge around the boy's legs. With that, smoke clones grab his feet, preventing him from being able to move or escape. The protagonist gets startled upon realizing that he fell into a dangerous smoke clone trap. Right then, several sharp weapons are hurled in his direction, cutting through the fog at high speed. The young orange-haired kid orders his elimination, and the blades hem the hero in from all sides. But the boy just stares at the situation, fully understanding the gravity of the fight at that very instant. Then the young man calmly closes his eyes, accepting that he is going to need to fight seriously now. At that, the enemy senses a sudden shift in the environment and widens his eyes, highly surprised. The dark-haired youth accepts the reality that he is facing a genuinely strong and dangerous opponent. At that moment, glowing blue marks appear on the young man's neck, and he laments the situation. He realizes that even after 500 years, the dream of a peaceful world is nothing more than an illusion. With that, the hero releases a roaring blue power, proving that the era of wars never truly ended. The young warrior focuses his entire attention with a sharp, glowing gaze that sends shivers down the spine. Right then, the shockwave of his power destroys all the weapons in midair, leaving his opponent terrified. The red-haired youth was using his mist to track the dark-haired youth's body heat and weight with precision. But upon activating his special power, the hero's presence simply vanishes into thousands of points. As soon as the protagonist releases his true ninja strength, his energy trail disappears. The hero's thermal image turns into a colorful swirl, completely impossible for his rival to decipher. The adversary begins to break into a cold sweat, feeling that the situation has slipped completely out of his control. A massive spiritual presence appears right behind him, making the enemy feel absolutely tiny. The red-haired youth panics because the hero's strength is so immense that it is impossible to locate him. He looks desperately in every direction, trying to find the dark-haired youth within the colorful mist. Suddenly, the young man appears right behind his opponent with a weapon pressed against his neck. With a slight smile on his face, the protagonist coldly announces that the victory in this battle belongs to him. He claims that if they were true enemies, the red-haired youth would already be defeated, and vows he knows nothing. The opponent stammers in fear, understanding none of it, and demands to know who he really is. The young man reveals that he is actually the warrior Goko, and that he reincarnated into this student's body. At that, the rival falls into complete shock upon hearing the name of the legendary and feared warrior from the past. The protagonist confirms the story with absolute seriousness, and the red-haired youth remains paralyzed with terror. With that, the dark-haired youth picks up his weapon from the ground and decides it is time to put an end to the conflict. The young man begins to walk away, warning that his adversary is going to have to explain a whole lot of things. The hooded boy stands there extremely surprised, trying to process whether that revelation could actually be real. He finds all of it complete madness, but decides to run after the dark-haired youth to clear up his doubts. Right then, a toad observes the two young men's movements with a confused, unblinking gaze. The young men arrive at a modern diner in the city called King Burger to grab something to eat. The hero stares at the sandwich with suspicion, wondering if that thing is actually meant to be eaten. His orange-haired companion patiently explains that this food is called a hamburger. While placing their order, the red-haired youth tries to flirt with the cashier, but gets a very direct rejection. They walk with their trays in hand, and the protagonist admits he has never seen food with those colors before. His companion takes a massive bite out of his meal, completely happy, while the dark-haired youth watches suspiciously. The boy carefully sniffs the sandwich, decides to take a small bite, and widens his eyes in surprise. He is completely marveled upon realizing that modern food is incredibly delicious. Right then, the sacred symbol of the secret alliance known as Shinoran is displayed on the screen. This organization serves to control modern-day warriors and prevent infighting and violence. They monitor the use of heavy weapons, dangerous substances, and blades outlawed by the legal system. The alliance also works to prevent turf wars between different criminal factions. They handle cases that even the police cannot solve, and to use jutsus, one must hold a license from them. The opponent explains that the alliance knows the face of every shinobi, which is why he found him suspicious. At that, the red-haired youth bows, offering a sincere apology while the dark-haired youth calmly eats French fries. The hero replies that it is fine, as he only received a small cut on his foot that will heal quickly. He speaks in a relaxed manner, but his adversary is shocked, wondering if something like that actually heals fast. The companion is completely bedazzled, finding the legendary warrior to be an incredible person. He remembers that Gokko is known in history as the strongest ninja to have ever existed. The red-haired youth gets emotional to be standing right before a true living legend of ancient history. But the reality is quite funny, as the hero is just devouring fries with his mouth full, looking rather clumsy. However, the young man tries to play down his massive admiration so he won't seem like a weak or amateur warrior. With that, he turns his face to the side, trying to hide his eagerness, while the protagonist stares at him in confusion. The red-haired youth sips his soda, thinking that showing too much excitement is the mark of a novice shinobi. The boy starts a conversation, commenting that this whole reincarnation business is something unbelievable to accept. Next, the orange-haired youth asks if the hero can also use powerful jutsus. The dark-haired youth replies seriously that the technique used to bring him back was not one of his own. He suspects that the mysterious spell has something to do with that one-eyed warrior he fought in the past. Furthermore, the boy leans in, advising that his current name in this new life is officially Hibari. The young man says his old name was left in the past, and that now he wishes to be called only Hibari. He states that he wants to try to live a normal life without carrying the weight of his war-torn era. The red-haired youth stares at the hero with stars in his eyes, finding his demeanor incredibly cool and stylish. The dark-haired youth also asks him to speak casually, since the two of them are almost the exact same age. His companion turns bright red with embarrassment and submissively agrees to the young man's orders. Clearing his throat, the red-haired youth promises to speak normally and mentions there is another reason for the attack. The hero asks if the matter concerns rogue warriors, and his classmate confirms with a serious look. The red-haired youth explains that revealing identities or using jutsus in front of civilians is strictly forbidden by law. But recently, some dangerous mercenaries have started attacking ordinary people out in the open. The companion reveals that the first incident occurred 1 month ago on a rainy day in the city. That night, the important minister of the environment decided to step into a deserted alleyway. He used the hidden spot to smoke his cigarette because he pretended in public that he despised smoking. Elite guards protected both exits of that narrow street, but something terrible happened anyway. Suddenly, the politician began to suffocate, feeling a terrible pain as his neck swelled up massively. The security team rushed over desperately upon seeing the man crash to the ground with ominous purple marks. The man let out one final groan of pain before passing away from the attack in that damp alley. A terrible red mark covered the walls of the area, showing the utter cruelty of that attack. Hearing the story, the protagonist holds his own chin, becoming thoughtful and shocked by the account. His classmate reveals that the autopsy found a lethal toxin and that new victims appeared in the exact same manner. They harmed innocent people without mercy, while the government hid the grim truth from the population. The young man squeezes his cup in anger, saying that only a highly skilled ninja could do such a thing. The red-haired youth vows that he will hunt down this coward no matter what, as his duty is to save people. The hero observes his companion, realizing that he is driven by a powerful sense of justice. He decides that he can trust that red-haired youth and listens as his classmate asks him to look at the people around them. The hooded boy points out the customers chatting calmly and living their lives in complete safety. He states that civilians think shinobis are just fiction and that things ought to stay that way. If the population discovered that assassins walk right alongside them, panic would grip the entire country. The red-haired youth explains that their duty is to protect the peace in secret, keeping the underworld hidden away. But this precious tranquility is being threatened because of the killer's cruel attacks. He imagines the place turned into a terrible massacre should that monster decide to attack the people right there. So the companion requests the hero's help to track down and capture this toxin user. The red-haired youth insists, saying that if the young man truly wants peace, he cannot ignore this threat. The dark-haired youth observes his classmate in silence, thinking deeply about the request for help he just received. He remembers that in the past he always lived solely by following the direct orders of his master. With that, the dark-haired youth closes his eyes, pondering who he should follow and obey in this new life. He recalls his ancient master's dream of building a peaceful world, free from pain for everyone. The hero focuses his thoughts on the era of tranquility that his beloved leader so desperately desired in the past. Then the boy opens his eyes with absolute determination and announces that he will assist with the mission. The red-haired youth becomes immensely happy, jumping for joy over having such a powerful ally by his side. With that, the companion grabs his phone and asks for the dark-haired youth's contact info to coordinate with the organization. The protagonist gets totally confused because he has absolutely no idea what a phone number even is. The red-haired youth humorously explains that nowadays, every single person uses a cell phone. At that, the dark-haired youth hands over his own device so his classmate can quickly set up the contact. But his classmate gets a surprise when he sees a photo of a red-haired girl on the screen with many missed calls. Meanwhile, the sun begins to set, and a mysterious silhouette walks down the street carrying suitcases. The hero walks back to his apartment and notices a young red-haired girl with her back turned, waiting for him. The girl spins around extremely angry, yelling that the dark-haired youth is late and demanding explanations. The young man feels quite awkward from the scolding and apologizes, unsure of how to handle the situation. At that, the young lady throws a massive tantrum and orders him to carry her suitcases and open the door quickly. As soon as they step inside, the red-haired girl begins sniffing the boy's clothes in a very suspicious manner. She complains, saying that he just got out of the hospital and already went out to eat junk food on the street. The young lady warns him in a lecturing tone that this kind of food acts like a poison to the body. The word poison makes the hero freeze in shock, immediately reminding him of the story about the killer. In reality, her name is Yui. She is a university student, and she is an acquaintance of the boy's family. The red-haired youth had discovered on the phone that the young lady was made responsible for taking care of him after the hospital. The orange-haired companion shouts with hearts in his eyes, thinking the neighbor is absolutely gorgeous. The hero becomes thoughtful, wondering if he really should meet up with her upon returning home. His classmate encourages the young man, showing him the location of the house through a map application. But right after, the red-haired youth grows serious, warning that the dark-haired youth needs to be careful from now on. He alerts him that in today's world, any ordinary person could be a dangerous ninja in disguise. Back in the present, a heavy rain begins to fall, and the hero stares at the sky while holding the suitcases. The girl calls for him to come inside, and the dark-haired youth picks up the heavy luggage and walks toward the apartment. While the rainwater pours down hard, strange noises begin to echo from inside a manhole. Just then, a mysterious and frightening force made of pure water extends a hand out of the opening. Unaware of the danger, the young lady walks down the building's hallway, and the young man follows her attentively. The youth observes her actions, trying to decipher the behavior of this new housemate. She repeats that bad food choices are highly detrimental, leaving the hero quite suspicious. The protagonist stares at the red-haired girl with a very serious look, wondering if he can truly trust her. The student enters the place and praises the room's neatness, while the dark-haired youth carries her luggage. But the boy feels uneasy when he notices the absurd weight of those suitcases she brought to the house. He finds it very strange that ordinary clothes would weigh so much, and suspects that she is hiding something. The young woman smiles mysteriously and announces that she brought an excellent gift, opening the suitcase. At that, the hero grows tense and readies himself for a fight, expecting to see some sort of secret weapon. She comments on his accident at the school, while casually rummaging through the suitcase. The red-haired girl claims that if he wants to defeat stronger opponents, he is going to need some assistance. With that, she pulls out a mysterious container with a dark-colored powder, putting the young man on high alert. The protagonist stares at the container, startled, thinking it might be some sort of dangerous substance. He panics, thinking about the possibility of that being the serial killer's terrible toxin. But the young lady holds up the jar with a grand smile, revealing that she only brought a protein supplement. The hero is left completely confused, with several question marks in his mind, not understanding what that is. The student sits on the floor, starts taking her things out of the suitcase, and complains that he is far too thin. With that, she mentions affectionately the long 10-year period they spent without seeing each other. Suddenly, the young woman drops a heavy iron dumbbell onto the floor, startling the boy with the loud crash. She displays various exercise pieces, saying that the dark-haired youth is weak and lacks any muscle. With that, she displays several pieces of gym equipment on the floor so that the young man can truly train. At that, the red-haired girl comments that otherwise, she will end up worrying about him every single night. At that moment, the dark-haired youth holds the weights in his hands, while feeling rather confused by it all. Then the young lady begins to demonstrate how each object works, striking funny poses around the room. But the young man stares at the girl coldly, wondering if she could be an enemy in disguise. Right then, the student tries to squeeze the equipment with both hands, even though she knows she should use only one. With that, the young man realizes that this red-haired girl truly is deeply concerned about her friend's health. At that moment, she rests her hand on the young man's chest with embarrassment, wondering why she is doing that. Then she explains that she owes a great deal to his mother, and that is why she will be living in his apartment for a while. But the dark-haired youth stares at the object in his hand, trying to comprehend the true intentions of that young lady. With that, she gives a beautiful smile, affectionately asking the young man never to think about passing away again. At that exact instant, the young man stares at her in silence, wondering if he really ought to tell the truth. He considers revealing to her that he is actually not the student she used to know in the past. So the warrior builds up his courage and opens his mouth to try to explain his true identity right there. But the red-haired girl stretches, cutting off the topic, and complains that she is feeling sweaty now. With that, she begins to take off her top right then and there, mentioning that the walk to the house was long. At that moment, the dark-haired youth widens his eyes, completely in shock at her sudden action. With that, her clothes go flying through the air, and she runs excitedly toward the bathroom for a shower. The young man turns extremely red with embarrassment, wondering if people no longer have a sense of decency. But the young lady just enjoys the warm water to relax her body amidst the steam of the shower. Meanwhile, the warrior sits alone in the living room, scrolling through his phone, listening to the sound of the running water. With that, he stares at the device's screen, which displays information confirming that she is just a civilian. At that moment, the young man observes the large suitcase on the floor and deduces that there is nothing dangerous inside. Suddenly, a mental spark hits the protagonist, making him sense a terrible sign of danger. He turns around quickly, completely on alert, realizing that something bizarre is about to happen. Just then, the dark-haired youth observes the heavy storm pouring down outside the window with a focused look. He remembers his allies' warning about the dangerous killer who always operated during the rain. With that, the hero raises his alert status, understanding that the rain provides the ideal weather for ninjas. He knows very well that the storm muffles footsteps and conceals the presence of an intruder. At that moment, the young man analyzes the structure of the place and notes that there is only one main door. So, the dark-haired youth calculates that there are exactly 3 windows on the first floor that could serve as access points. Right then, he also recalls the other 2 glass openings located on the second floor. With that, the hero decides to closely monitor every single corner of the apartment to avoid surprises. But in the bathroom, the young lady keeps washing up peacefully, completely unaware of the strange noise happening right there. At that exact instant, a bizarre creature made of pure water begins to silently emerge from the drain. Suddenly, the water monster takes on its physical form right behind the young lady, whose back is turned. The opponent managed to break into the place through an underground access point that the young man did not know about. At that, the student feels a strange chill and begins to turn around slowly to see what is going on. With that, she comes face to face with the silhouette of that mystical being and stands paralyzed with terror in the shower. The monster opens its bizarre mouth with a massive tongue and prepares to strike the poor young lady. At that moment, the red-haired girl lets out a desperate scream of panic as she realizes the threat standing before her. But a swift fist strikes the intruder right in the face, sending water splashing in every direction. Then, the protagonist appears like a flash of lightning, protecting the young lady and blocking the creature's strike. At that, both of them are highly surprised to notice that the attack did not generate any sort of physical impact. The hero realizes instantly that trying to strike the opponent is exactly the same as punching water. With that, the young man throws a towel to cover the young lady and orders her to go hide very quickly. At that instant, the red-haired girl obeys, shaking with terror as she hides away in the corner of the bathroom. So, she flees to a safe spot, and the dark-haired youth focuses his entire attention on that opponent. But the mystical creature begins to rapidly regenerate and returns to its original form. Just then, the young warrior faces his rival head-on and instantly deduces that this monster is a ninja. At that, the terrible water monster just lets out a bizarre laugh and readies itself for combat. With that, he mocks the protagonist and praises the fact that the young man noticed his intrusion. At that moment, the dark-haired youth demands to know if this intruder is the person responsible for the attacks in the city. But the bizarre adversary ignores the question and begins talking to his pet fish instead. Then the monster calls the hero a complete fool and states that he would never reveal his plans. He mocks him, saying he might consider the matter if the young man handed over the red-haired girl from the shower. At that, the warrior glares at his enemy with a look of intense fury upon hearing such audacity. With that, the intruder creates a liquid sculpture of the young lady, laughing and commenting on how beautiful she is. At that instant, the villain licks his lips, saying he loves to savor the tears of his victims. But the dark-haired youth merely replies that he understands the situation and begins to release his mystical energy. Then the hero with the glowing gaze gives a serious warning that he is going to send that scoundrel straight to the underworld. Right then, the rival charges forward at high speed, throwing a glowing punch against the protagonist inside the bathroom. With that, he flashes a terrifying smile and says that the power of water can be thoroughly destructive. At that moment, the mystical creature activates its secret technique to overwhelm the young man's body. But the hero perfectly evades the swift strike and notices that his rival's skin suffered absolutely no damage. Then, the young man delivers a direct strike to his opponent's heart, to test his physical resilience. At that, the dark-haired youth's hand simply passes right through the monster's chest, generating a splash of water. With that, the young man is shocked to realize that his despicable adversary can completely liquefy his body. At that exact instant, the enemy lets out an insane laugh and begins to envelop the protagonist's face. He warns that he is going to suffocate the hero by blocking his breathing, and enters through the dark-haired youth's mouth. But the young man tries every possible way to grab the liquid opponent, failing repeatedly because of the jutsu. At that, the warrior panics upon realizing that the monster is invading his very own body. With that, the story explains that the biggest problem in this fight is that villain's specific element. At that moment, we discover that shinobi techniques possess 5 basic, well-defined elements. Then, we learn that any ninja who undergoes brutal training can manage to master one of them. But in extremely rare cases, some powerful shinobis can manage to awaken advanced variations. Just then, the story displays his ally's smoke style, which is a derivative of the fire style. With that, we recall that the protagonist of the past was never able to manifest a magical element. At that exact instant, we discover that he became the strongest of all using nothing but his physical reinforcement. Therefore, his mystical abilities function by transforming his own body into a literal weapon, but against a liquid opponent who ignores physical impacts. This battle becomes exceptionally difficult. At that, the dark-haired youth realizes that this enemy made of pure water is the worst possible matchup for his punches. With that, the young man truly begins to suffocate on the floor with all that water inside his throat. At that moment, the monster bursts out laughing while traveling straight down the young man's esophagus. Then, the villain shouts from inside the dark-haired youth, cruelly warning that he has no way to escape. But the hero refuses to give up and concentrates every bit of energy he has left into his right fist. Right then, the warrior focuses his spiritual power into his punch and prepares an attack of extreme force. With that, the dark-haired youth completely shatters the bathroom wall with a highly violent impact. At that instant, the young man leaps through the destroyed opening, throwing himself outside into the middle of the storm. Suddenly, the monster Skly inside him gets a massive scare, completely failing to understand this crazy action. He lands on the wet pavement of the sidewalk under the pouring rain, leaving his enemy in total shock. At that, the intruder wonders if the dark-haired youth has completely lost his mind due to the lack of oxygen. With that, the villain thinks to himself that fighting under the intense rain will only grant him an absolute advantage. At that moment, the protagonist flashes a confident smile and warns that this is his rival's final chance to run away. Then, the intruder becomes intrigued by the dark-haired youth's calm demeanor while he unleashes a bizarre power. But the monster tries to calm himself down, thinking that suffocation is just a matter of time before his victory. Right then, the red-eyed opponent focuses on his surroundings, trying to understand that young man's plan. With that, the villain falls into complete panic upon noticing that the protagonist is merely playing with him. At that exact instant, the monster tries to escape from the hero's body and prepares a water vortex. Then, the dark-haired youth uses his extreme physical strength and spits his rival out into the heavy storm. Right then, the protagonist continues to be terribly suffocated by the creature right in the middle of the street. With that, the enemy orders the young man to just give up already and die of suffocation while laughing out loud. At that moment, the youth launches himself with all his might high into the air, leaving a trail of destruction behind. Then the hero soars through the sky and reaches an incredible height to escape the tense situation. But the dangerous intruder is left completely astonished, unable to comprehend what the young man is about to do. Just then, the warrior rapidly extends his arm to grab a heavy electrical cable. With that, the monster notices that the dark-haired youth is hanging from a high-voltage wire and falls into despair. At that exact instant, the villain panics completely and begs his opponent not to do anything crazy. Then, the hero decides to endure the pain, knowing that this is going to be a true test of endurance. But the young man uses his extraordinary strength to snap the cable, releasing a massive amount of blue energy. Right then, a powerful electrical charge begins to course through the dark-haired youth's entire body. With that, the intruder hidden inside him takes the full blast of the discharge and screams in pure agony. At that moment, the hero grits his teeth in pain from the shock, but keeps holding onto the cable. Then, the story explains that the ninjas of the past knew how to channel the energy of nature. He was able to sense instantly that the mysterious black cable contained a massive electrical charge. At that, the terrible water monster cannot withstand the pressure of the shock and flees through the young man's mouth. With that, the protagonist screams with all his might while focusing entirely on expelling the scoundrel. At that instant, the warrior is left exhausted and trembling, feeling the full impact of the electric shock. Then the hero finally manages to spit the last remaining part of that water being out. But the creature falls to the ground, completely dazed by the electricity, and the dark-haired youth breathes a sigh of relief. Right then, the enemy's liquid body plummets onto the wet asphalt, and the young man climbs down from the pole. With that, the opponent realizes he can no longer keep his jutsu active because he is too heavily damaged. At that moment, the wounded monster falls into despair, trying to think of a way to escape quickly. Then, the dark-haired youth walks imposingly toward his rival and notices that the storm is coming to a stop. But when the villain tries to crawl away, the warrior approaches and grabs him by the tongue. Just then, the protagonist lifts his mystical adversary high into the air, proving his physical superiority. With that, the hero coldly warns him that his foolish little game with water has come to an end right then and there. At that exact instant, the young man readies a devastating punch, channeling the final remaining sparks into his fist. Then, the enemy desperately begs for mercy upon realizing that he is about to be destroyed. But the young man delivers the final blow with mastery, shattering that ninja's liquid form completely. Just then, the dark-haired youth watches the villain dissolve entirely into the asphalt and walks back home. With that, a tiny red fish leaps from the water, indicating the definitive conclusion of that combat. At that moment, the Secret Alliance confirms that the dangerous serial killer has been defeated. Then, the warrior observes the small, lifeless animal on the ground and reflects on the tranquility of the night. He picks up the little creature carefully, wondering if all modern shinobis have tricks like this. Just then, the dark-haired youth lets out a tired sigh as he looks at the massive hole he made in the wall. With that, the young man enters the apartment, complaining of intense pain from overexerting his weak body. At that exact instant, the youth realizes that his current endurance is far lower than it was in his old life. Then the warrior admits that he got lucky that the enemy used water style, which is weak against lightning. He knows that against a high-level rival, things would be extremely difficult to resolve. Just then, the dark-haired youth enters the room, thinking seriously to himself that he is going to need to train a whole lot more. With that, the young man opens the closet door and comes across the red-haired girl huddled inside a towel. At that moment, the neighbor looks up with tears in her eyes, displaying absolute terror over the situation. Then the protagonist gives a calm and comforting smile, advising her that the danger has already passed. But the young lady keeps staring at the young man with a frightened expression, completely unable to speak. Just then, she notices his clothes are totally torn and scorched, and wonders to herself what happened. With that, the girl stares at the dark-haired youth with immense sadness, not understanding what that monster was. At that instant, the red-haired girl suddenly throws herself into the young man's arms, startling the protagonist a bit. Then she leans against his chest, whispering in a trembling voice that she cannot manage to stand on her feet. But the dark-haired youth merely accepts the situation and offers his friendly shoulder to comfort the young lady. Just then, the red-haired girl looks shyly at the floor, her cheeks flushed after receiving his help. With that, she rests her head gently against the dark-haired youth's chest and thanks him for saving her life. At that moment, the young man stares at the girl and feels his face warm up a little from the close proximity. Then the warrior takes swift action, scooping the young lady up with ease and carrying her. But the neighbor gets a big scare from the sudden action and yells at the young man to put her down. At that, the hero humorously explains that he was only following her orders to offer physical support. With that, he understands his mistake and shifts to holding the red-haired girl in a normal, more comfortable way. At that instant, the young lady apologizes and admits she was wrong to call the young man weak. Then, she praises the youth in a good-natured way, commenting that he seems much sharper and more confident now. But the dark-haired youth just gives an amicable, welcoming smile, feeling that the two of them have grown closer. Just then, the young man makes a video call to his ally, letting him know that the monster has been captured. With that, his orange-haired classmate mentions over the phone that he will send a team to collect the target. At that moment, the red-haired youth squats on top of a tall building, observing the city below. Then, the warrior observes the prisoner lying on the bed, wondering if he really was the serial killer. But his hooded companion deduces that the water element would perfectly explain the ease of breaking into places. Just then, the hero shows that he found a small fish in the room, meaning someone was spying on the fight. With that, the scene focuses on the dark-haired youth sitting in his room, keeping an eye on the prisoner tied to the bed. At that exact instant, the young man stares at the small cup of water, agreeing that this was the logical conclusion. Then, the red-haired youth claims that the only way to get the correct answers would be by interrogating the target. But suddenly, the hooded companion sees something bizarre on his phone and lets out a desperate shout. Right then, the ally desperately warns the hero to look behind him because there is a threat inside the room. With that, the dark-haired youth spins around and comes across several green toads crawling over the prisoner. At that moment, the red-haired youth screams desperately, saying that the goal of those creatures is to silence the witness. Then the ally tells the dark-haired youth to act fast, since that prisoner is their only source of information. But the hero notices instantly that the amphibians are armed with highly lethal poison needles. Just then, the toads launch their venomous needles, and his classmate begs him not to let the guy perish. With that, the dark-haired youth realizes in a fraction of a second that he would not be able to reach them in time by running. At that instant, the young man concentrates his mystical energy into his fingertips at high speed. Then, the youth grabs the pens from the desk, preparing a precise throw enhanced by his power. He hurls the objects in mere milliseconds, creating glowing projectiles aimed at the animals. Right then, the improvised projectiles strike the amphibians dead on, splashing blood across the room. With that, the hero completes the throw masterfully, managing to hit every single target all at once. At that moment, the youth notices a trail left by a needle that just barely grazed his own face. Then he widens his eyes in dread upon realizing that one of the attacks slipped right past his defense. Sure enough, one of the venomous needles pierces straight into the prisoner's neck, drawing blood. At that, the captured man lets out a terrible groan of pure pain and begins to suffocate because of the poison. With that, the terrible toxin spreads, and the prisoner begins to swell up in a highly bizarre manner. At that instant, the enemy screams in pure agony, right in front of the dark-haired youth, who stares at it all in shock. Then, the prisoner's body simply detonates, generating a massive screen of red smoke. But the hero shields his face with his arms and notices another amphibian hidden away in the corner of the room. Just then, the young man charges forward with everything, delivering a swift strike to crush the last remaining animal. With that, the toad simply vanishes into thin air, transforming its body into a cloud of smoke. At that moment, the youth is left surprised to notice that the creature vanished right before his eyes. Then he analyzes the bodies of the defeated amphibians and notices that they are melting away. But right after, all the toads turn into pools of blood and completely disintegrate right there. Just then, the ally shouts frantically over the phone, wanting to know if the dark-haired youth saved the victim. With that, the young man stares at the blood-stained bed, deeply regretting that he failed the mission. At that instant, the red-haired youth claims that the marks of passing are identical to the other cases in the city. Then the dark-haired youth mentions that all the toads vanished, confirming that it was merely a technique. But his ally irritably concludes that the true killer is the user who controls the toads. At that, the red-haired youth laments over the phone, claiming that their greatest source of information has perished. But the dark-haired youth stares at the remains in the room, advising that they actually did not walk away empty-handed. With that, the young man analyzes the marks on the deceased's skin and notices that the tattoo was very recent. At that moment, the hooded ally realizes that their adversary was just an ordinary civilian up until last month. Then he explains in surprise that a secret shinobi mark is not something easy to acquire. However, the orange-haired ninja is suspicious of the bizarre speed at which their rival awakened. Just then, the protagonist stares at his phone with a serious expression and deduces two important facts from the attack. With that, he explains that the true poison killer is gathering more pawns across the city. At that exact instant, the young man concludes that the enemy has a bizarre method for awakening jutsus in civilians. Then the red-haired youth wonders in worry how that could even be possible, while the dark-haired youth stares at the horizon. He warns that the situation is terrible, as dozens of innocent civilians could end up awakening powers. Just then, the ally imagines the city consumed by absolute chaos, with ordinary people fighting and destroying each other. With that, the red-haired youth suggests sending the prisoner's remains straight to the Union for an autopsy. At that moment, the dark-haired youth agrees, thinking that medical examinations might reveal the secret. Then, the hooded ninja invites the hero to accompany him to the headquarters of the secret organization. He explains that he needs to introduce the young man to the boss so he can officially join the operation. At that, the protagonist accepts the proposal in a calm manner and ends the call right at that moment. With that, the dark-haired youth stares at the large full moon through the blue curtain of his bedroom window. At that instant, the hero mentally prepares himself for his very first official visit to the Union. Meanwhile, the scene displays a mysterious greenhouse filled with tropical palm trees in the darkness. Suddenly, a purple-haired ninja wakes up startled, struggling to breathe properly. Just then, the prisoner looks around in confusion, not understanding where he is or how he ended up there. With that, the bound young man realizes that his arms and legs are restrained with heavy ropes. At that moment, the youth tries to maintain his composure to remember his identity as an agent of the Union. Then, he recalls being on a scouting mission, sitting on top of some pipes in an alleyway. But the prisoner remembers catching a highly sweet scent of pink smoke that clouded his mind. Just then, the young man recalls getting dizzy and plummeting from the beam, straight into the enemy's clutches. With that, he deduces that he was drugged by his mysterious rival before being brought to this location. At that exact instant, the young man in the bandana realizes he is in deep trouble because he does not know the location. So he stares at the large trees around him and notices the hot, humid climate of a jungle. But a loud sound of a toad croaking catches the prisoner's attention, putting him on high alert. At that, the bound young man widens his eyes upon realizing that a terrible danger is drawing close. With that, he spots a giant toad staring right at him while he hears slow footsteps approaching. At that moment, a mysterious figure wearing high-heeled boots appears and asks if he is finally awake. Then, a woman wearing an eerie mask with 4 glowing eyes approaches the prisoner. But the young man in the bandana yells out, demanding to know who that eerie person standing in front of him is. Just then, the red-haired young lady laughs provocatively, mocking the prisoner's question. With that, the young man tries to buy some time by acting smug and challenging the villainess. At that exact instant, the agent plans to distract his captor while attempting to shift his body. Then he activates his blue energy to slide his hands through the ropes, a bone popping in the process. But suddenly the prisoner feels an absurd weight in his arms and cannot manage to move at all. At that, the masked assassin scoffs at him, warning that any escape attempt is completely useless there. With that, she explains in a sadistic manner that his body was completely paralyzed by a neurotoxin. At that moment, the purple-haired youth becomes terrified and asks if she is the poison user. Then, the villainess kneels down while holding a small green toad and replies that she is not the creator of the toxins. However, she points to the tiny amphibian in her hand and reveals that they do all the dirty work. Just then, the young lady comments that their vibrant colors are as beautiful as real gemstones. With that, she displays a tube of food paste, squeezing the nourishment out for the small amphibian. At that exact instant, the criminal smiles behind her mask, explaining that she merely serves them their meals. Then, she reveals that she mixes the poison into their food as soon as the toxins become potent. Just then, the story displays the terrible poison developing in a frightening manner inside the greenhouse. With that, the villainess shows her twisted intentions while mocking the agent's absolute weakness. At that moment, the bound youth yells out in outrage upon realizing that the deaths were nothing but experiments. Then, the masked woman coldly explains that humans also perform bizarre testing of their own. However, the enemy decides to put her new plan into action and brings the venomous little toad close to the guy. At that, the bizarre amphibian opens its mouth in a frightening way and emits a sharp screech in the room. With that, dozens of noisy toads surround the poor immobilized young man, sending him into a total panic. At that instant, the purple-haired warrior trembles with terror upon seeing the massive number of creatures. Then, the villainess states that she needed to eliminate the previous ninja because he was far too inefficient. But she laments that the old poison was weak, since it still left the victims' bodies completely intact. Just then, the woman reveals that she needs to create a much more potent formula so it won't leave any traces. With that, the captor prepares for the final test, and the prisoner desperately tries to break free. At that moment, she explains that the new compound must dissolve flesh and bone without leaving a single clue. Then, the toad spits a red-colored venomous projectile straight onto the chest of the young man in the bandana. But the prisoner screams in rage, unleashing his true hidden power with a furious glare. Just then, the young man channels every bit of his vital energy and activates his fire style to burn the ropes away. With that, a massive wave of flames detonates across the area, creating a literal inferno inside the greenhouse. At that exact instant, the assassin merely flashes a sadistic smile, thanking him for sacrificing himself. Then, a powerful beam of acid rips through the flames and strikes the warrior dead on in the forehead. Tragically, the terrible toxin begins to dissolve the poor young man's face in an agonizing manner. Just then, the youth's body completely melts away in a matter of seconds, proving the formula's success. With that, the villainess observes the outcome, laughing with absolute pride over creating the perfect mixture. At that moment, nothing remains but the ninja's scorched clothes resting over a puddle of gray liquid. Then the assassin holds her small green toad and names the technique the poison style. Furthermore, she displays a twisted affection for her pet and celebrates their newfound strength. Just then, the story shifts scenarios and displays the illuminated facade of the famous Tokyo station. With that, the protagonist and the red-haired youth take a secret elevator down into the city's underground. At that exact instant, they reach a depth of nearly 200 meters and spot a traditional temple. Then the scene reveals the imposing main entrance of the Union's headquarters, decorated with a mask. However, the two of them keep walking down the long stone pathway lit by ancient lanterns. Just then, the dark-haired youth observes the place in amazement that a mansion of that scale could exist underground. With that, a little girl wearing a kimono steps out from the shadows, holding a cage with a parrot inside. At that moment, the red bird begins to speak in a bizarre manner, welcoming the warrior. Then, the protagonist becomes confused upon realizing that the leader's imposing voice is coming from the creature. However, Director Manson introduces himself through the parrot and advises that the young man will undergo a test. Just then, the hero and his orange-haired classmate are left surprised by that immediate demand. With that, the leader explains that his mystical technique allows him to borrow the eyes and mouths of animals. At that instant, the young girl carrying the bird bows in silence, revealing herself as the caretaker. Then the ally whispers, mentioning that to this very day, he has never seen his great boss's true face. But the bird apologizes for not revealing itself and asks the dark-haired youth not to be upset. At that, the hero understands, thinking to himself that concealing one's face is essential for a leader's safety. With that, the director of the Union politely expresses his gratitude for the young man's understanding through the parrot. At that moment, the red-haired youth seriously asks what the exact purpose of conducting this test would be. Then, his classmate tries to deafen the dark-haired youth, guaranteeing that his skills have already been proven. But the bird replies that he does not doubt the reports, and merely needs to follow the union's regulations. Just then, the bird explains that, to grant the license, it is mandatory to discover the attribute of his technique. With that, the protagonist learns that the rules require him to demonstrate the element of his jutsu. At that instant, the young man replies directly to the parrot, revealing that his abilities possess no element. Then, the animal stares at the youth for a moment, looking at the dark-haired youth in an attentive and suspicious manner. However, the scene displays the 5 classic elemental styles of ninjutsu, and the conversation grows tense. Just then, the leader recalls that in the past, the young man became the strongest ninja in the world without using elements. With that, he highlights the legend of Goko, who used to defeat entire armies using nothing but his bare body. At that moment, the director explains that in the present, the soul of that living legend inhabits this young student. Then, the protagonist is highly surprised to notice that the Union knows perfectly well who he is. But the leader considers that the new body might have brought along magical attributes that have not yet awakened. Just then, the hooded red-haired youth widens his eyes, agreeing that this was an interesting possibility. With that, the young man stares at the floor thoughtfully, remembering that techniques channel the power of nature. At that exact instant, he deduces that if his body changed, his magical element might have changed as well. Then a black cat appears holding a beautiful candlestick in its mouth and walks to the center of the room. However, the bird asks if the dark-haired youth does not wish to finally discover his own mystical element. Just then, the feline takes its position and displays the lit candle that will serve to perform the mystical test. With that, everyone in the tatami room grows extremely serious, awaiting the start of the ritual. At that moment, the organization's director announces the official start of the famous flame ritual. Then, the dark-haired youth sits cross-legged in front of the candelabra to concentrate his power. Meanwhile, his classmate and the little assistant stand by watching in silence, waiting for the result. Just then, the hero calmly closes his eyes, breathing deeply, and begins to refine his energy. With that, the young man brings his hands together in a prayer and releases a massive amount of sparks into the air. At that exact instant, he performs the ancient secret signs known as the 9 shinobi symbols. Then, the rapid movements of his fingers begin to refine his spiritual flow in an incredible way. Finally, the dark-haired youth concludes the sequence of classic gestures to awaken the strength within his soul. Just then, a powerful barrier of golden energy envelops the protagonist, making the ground vibrate. With that, his ally is marveled to notice that his friend's spiritual power shines as bright as a diamond. At that moment, massive waves of force keep radiating from the young man, making the room feel heavy. Then the bird stares at the dark-haired youth in absolute astonishment, deeply impressed by his vital energy. Meanwhile, the little assistant begins to shake with fear, unable to withstand the young man's spiritual pressure. Just then, the little girl in the kimono widens her eyes and grits her teeth, nearly collapsing from the power. With that, the leader asks her not to overexert herself and orders the little one to close her eyes immediately. At that instant, the director warns that she is still far too young to endure such immense spiritual strength. Then, the girl obeys, squeezing her eyes shut while trying to breathe amidst all that heavy pressure. However, the candle remains lit in the center of the tatami, awaiting the mystical reaction of the element. Just then, the story explains that the flame should grow with fire or change color with earth. With that, the protagonist focuses all of his golden chakra, hoping to see what transformation will take place. At that moment, the young man brings his hands close to the fire and concentrates the maximum force of his energy. Then the candle simply continues to burn in a completely normal and stable manner, without a single alteration. At that, the hooded ally's jaw drops, completely confused to see that absolutely nothing happened. Just then, those present in the room merely observe the scene, unable to comprehend the reason for the outcome. With that, the dark-haired youth opens his eyes, realizing that the candle's flame did not move even a single millimeter. At that instant, the young man and the parrot stare at each other in absolute silence, quite surprised by the failure. Then the protagonist lets out a long, tired sigh and relaxes his arms, giving up on forcing it. However, he flashes an awkward smile upon noticing that he still lacks any magical element in this body. Just then, the red-haired youth falls backward in a completely comical shock, thoroughly disappointed by the result. With that, the hero scratches his head with a laugh, commenting that he is already used to fighting without elements anyway. At that moment, his ally yells out in frustration as he was eager to witness a high-level jutsu. Then, the director stares at the candle inquisitively, noticing something very bizarre within the flame. However, the leader is suspicious of the fact that someone can refine so much spiritual power without a single element. Just then, he calls assistant by her name, catching the attention of the little girl in the room. With that, the boss orders the lit candle to be put away, as he wishes to perform detailed examinations in the laboratory. At that instant, the girl agrees, nodding her head obediently as she stares at the fire. Then, the director officially concludes the test and hands over an object for the assistant to deliver. At that, Pokori hands over the wooden plaque containing the organization's approved official shinobi license. Just then, the protagonist stares at the small identification card in his hands, looking quite thoughtful. With that, the parrot explains imposingly that he now holds official permission to use jutsus. At that moment, the mystical leader advises that the card will resolve any potential issues with others. Then, the bird shifts topics and reveals that the Union scientists have already completed the autopsy. However, both young men get a big scare when the director announces that the result is already prepared. Just then, the little assistant hands over a sealed green scroll containing all the information. With that, the dark-haired youth receives the document in his hands, and the little girl asks him to burn everything after reading. At that instant, the young man realizes that the report contains fundamental clues regarding the poison user. Then the bird flaps its wings gently, requesting that the hero use all of his power for the sake of peace. But the protagonist responds with absolute determination in his eyes, asserting that he has always operated that way. Just then, the scene shifts, showing both young men dressed in their school uniforms in the morning. With that, the red-haired youth begins spinning the sealed scroll on his finger, admitting the report was a surprise. At that moment, he reveals that the probability of the killer being at their own school is massive. Then the ally lets out a tense sigh of worry while walking right alongside the hero. However, the hooded companion uses his firepower to burn the scroll away, erasing all traces. Just then, the dark-haired youth warns seriously that their identities must already be known after that previous fight. With that, the red-haired youth begins to break into a cold sweat, realizing they are at an absurd disadvantage now. At that exact instant, the protagonist merely flashes a challenging smile, warning that the enemy is welcome to try. Then the two of them begin walking resolutely toward the school's interior to launch their search. But on the rooftop above, a mysterious black-haired girl observes them both with a sadistic grin. Just then, a terrible, smiling silhouette monitors the hero's every step through the school window. With that, the young men head up the school's gray stairs, trying to act completely natural. At that moment, the red-haired youth thinks to himself in frustration that he has already combed the entire building and found 0 clues. Therefore, the ally deduces that this poison user is operating at an absurd level of stealth. However, the story flashes back to the past, showing when they were casually eating lunch in the park. Just then, the protagonist savors his delicious lunchbox of meat and rice, weeping with joy. With that, the young man widens his eyes, experiencing a true explosion of flavors inside his mouth. At that exact instant, he delights in the wonderful meal while his classmate checks the document. Then, the dark-haired youth looks curiously at the report in his friend's hands, wanting to know about the clues. But the ally explains that the water rival actually used to be just an ordinary civilian. Just then, the file displays a photo of Shizuku Gesso, showing that he worked in sanitation. With that, the document reveals that the deceased loved raising small fish in his aquarium. At that moment, the little assistant is seen tenderly caring for all the rescued animals. Then, the dark-haired youth listens to the story in relief while the red-haired youth keeps reading the details. However, forensics discovered a microscopic needle mark on the deceased's skin that almost went unnoticed. Just then, the two warriors surprisingly conclude that the awakening of Jutsus was caused by an injection. With that, the ally reveals that the spy network managed to trace the manufacturing of the syringe. At that exact instant, the Union's boss used the eyes of the city's birds to track the transport route. Thus, we discover that the shipments of venomous needles were taken straight to our school. However, the protagonist listens to the information while maintaining a calm and resolute stance toward the mission. Just then, the hero picks up a small wooden twig and begins carving the object with a pocket knife. With that, the orange-haired youth stares at the scene in confusion, not understanding what he is doing. At that moment, the dark-haired youth calmly advises that he is preparing a small weapon. Then, the warrior flashes a slight, mysterious smile, calling that little stick a secret weapon. However, the story returns to the present, showing the two of them walking down the school hallways. Just then, the ally warns tensely that they must be careful around any strange person. With that, he asks the hero to keep his eyes wide open for anyone who might approach them. At that exact instant, several female students excitedly surround the dark-haired youth, filming him for social media. Then the students comment in surprise that the dark-haired youth sent the bully Kumazawa to the hospital. But the hooded classmate gets terrified upon noticing that the entire school already knows about that trouble. Just then, the teacher heavily berates the young man for getting involved in a street fight. At that moment, the red-haired youth stands in complete shock upon noticing that even the faculty knows about the conflict. Right then, he remembers that only the defeated Bullsey's cronies were present at the fight. With that, the students keep gossiping, and the red-haired youth wonders who exactly spread the rumor. At that exact instant, the orange-haired youth panics and warns that the situation looks real bad. He imagines that the mysterious killer might be hidden right in the middle of that crowd of students. Then the dark-haired youth reasons calmly, deducing that the two of them were being watched the entire time. Just then, we recall the small green toad that was spying on the entire previous fight from the bushes. With that, the warrior concludes that this poison user was the true author of the gossip. At that moment, the protagonist places his hand inside his pocket and prepares a silent counterattack. However, the crowd of noisy students begins rushing toward the two of them down the hallway. Then, the youth with the confident gaze holds a small shiny coin and decides to make a move. Just then, the hero hurls the metallic object at high speed, generating a powerful spark of blue energy. With that, the improvised projectile strikes the window, shattering the glass with a loud crash inside the school. At that instant, dozens of sharp shards fall scattered across the floor, shining in the light. Then, the students get a massive scare and begin shouting, failing to understand the reason for the accident. Just then, the crowd backs away in fear, staring at the sharp pieces of glass in the hallway. With that, the red-haired youth stares at the damage in shock, noticing his ally used a coin to shatter it. At that moment, his partner analyzes the situation and realizes that the shards form a barrier. He notices that the sharp glass tips act exactly like those metal spikes used by ninjas. Then the bell rings and the teacher seriously orders all students to return to their classrooms. Just then, the woman leaves, mentioning she will call maintenance, and the girls say goodbye to the protagonist. With that, the red-haired youth notes that the barrier was only a temporary solution to keep the curious onlookers away. At that instant, the hero gives a confident smile and asserts that he has already unraveled the entire mystery. He guarantees with absolute certainty that he has finally discovered the user's true identity. Then the two warriors walk resolutely down the hallway, ready to launch their offensive. Just then, the scene displays the student guidance counseling office, where the teacher is preparing hot tea. With that, she calmly pours the boiling water over the cup, releasing steam into the air. At that moment, the young woman glares at her wristwatch, commenting that the boy is quite late. Then, the young, dark-haired youth enters the room silently and greets the teacher in a cold manner. Just then, she fakes sweetness and comments on his punishment, but the warrior tells her to drop the act. With that, the hero looks the teacher dead in the eye and addresses her directly as the poison user. At that instant, he asks if she honestly thought she wasn't being watched and reminds her of the glass. He explains that he took advantage of the distraction from the broken glass to launch a blind spot attack. Then, the protagonist reveals that at that exact instant of confusion, he attacked everyone in the hallway. Just then, the dark-haired youth mentions he used those tiny wooden needles he had carved in the park. With that, all the ordinary students were struck without even noticing, but the teacher evaded it effortlessly. At that moment, the youth highlights that she was the single person capable of dodging the needle. Therefore, the hero asserts that needles are the most basic hidden weapons of any warrior. Just then, the young man deduces she dodged out of fear of the poison, and that no normal human would do that. With that, we discover that the brilliant mind behind the serial killings is precisely her. At that instant, the villainess lets out a bizarre and terrifying laugh, admitting she has been found out. Then, the protagonist grabs his sharp pen and seriously warns that he is going to eliminate the threat. Just then, the enemy stretches and comments that she no longer needs to keep using the disguise. With that, she rips her clothes away, displaying a pair of black scorpion tattoos on her skin. At that exact instant, the dark-haired youth focuses his gaze upon noticing the famous forbidden mark of criminals. Then the assassin hurls her fake hair into the air, and her body begins to undergo a mutation. Just then, her bones pop in a frightening manner, revealing that rival's true stature. With that, the warrior realizes that she was utilizing a complex transformation technique. At that moment, the hero raises his guard against the contorted assassin, who reveals her true intention. At that moment, the young man focuses his eyes and instantly realizes that this opponent is an experienced warrior. Just then, the rival reveals his true identity, claiming to be the dangerous ninja agent Mogai. With that, the opponent mocks the young man, commenting that he thought his disguise was flawless. At that instant, the villain begins to contort himself in an extremely bizarre manner, making strange sounds. Then, the bizarre ninja charges with total speed across the office floor, letting out a frustrated shout. However, the hero begins to refine his golden mystical energy around his neck to protect himself. Just then, the two warriors begin exchanging rapid blows in an incredible sequence of dodges. With that, the protagonist ducks with extreme mastery, evading a lethal strike from his rival. At that moment, the opponent grabs a massive syringe filled with venomous liquid to inject him. Then the two clash their weapons, generating a massive physical impact right in the middle of the office. But the bizarre villain opens his mouth and uses his toad's tongue to fire off a surprise attack. Just then, the hero performs an unbelievable acrobatic maneuver in midair, managing to escape the dangerous attack. With that, the young man analyzes his enemy's movements and notes that his fighting style is irregular. At that instant, the youth concentrates to the absolute maximum, understanding that a single scratch could prove fatal. Then, the killer snaps his tongue, quite irritated to see that the protagonist evaded his hit. Just then, the dark-haired youth uses his energized pen to shatter his adversary's dangerous syringe. With that, the red-eyed rival falls into complete panic upon seeing his vial destroyed. At that moment, the hero coldly advises that he noticed the danger and decided to break the object. Then, the scene displays the exact moment when the pen's tip pierced the medicine's glass. Just then, the killer deeply laments, weeping over the waste of that substance pooled on the floor. With that, the villain complains in a grumpy manner, saying that producing the mixture is hard work. At that exact instant, he coldly explains that normal human beings drop from a single dose. Thus, we discover that the monster needed to collect hundreds of test subjects to create the formula. Just then, the rival glares at the youth with a look of pure hatred, asking if he understood its value. With that, the hero demands to know the exact number of innocent people who were sacrificed. At that moment, the killer proudly confesses that he eliminated 178 people. He brags he makes a point of memorizing every single one of the tests he performed. Then the protagonist falls into complete silence and a dark aura of fury envelops him. Just then, the dark-haired youth advances with total ferocity, ready to deliver a definitive strike on the monster. With that, the villain mentions the young red-haired girl's name, startling the young man and making him halt his hit. At that instant, the enemy flashes a sadistic smile, wondering if his neighbor is doing well. Then the hero widens his eyes in dread upon realizing that his opponent laid a trap. Just then, the story displays the red-haired neighbor's apartment, where she is preparing to do yoga. With that, the gorgeous girl begins to stretch with a calm smile, completely oblivious to the danger nearby. At that moment, the villain cruelly reveals that the dark-haired youth's neighbor has become his hostage in this fight. Then, the killer explains that he scattered camouflaged venomous toads all across the young lady's apartment. Just then, he guarantees that it takes only a single mental command for the creatures to attack the young woman. With that, the opponent mocks the hero's enraged face, asking if he is irritated now. At that instant, the monster orders the dark-haired youth not to take a single step if he wishes to keep his neighbors safe. Then, the cruel creature warns that he will take the red-haired girl's life without hesitation if the hero reacts. Just then, the rival brings his terrifying face close, mocking the young man's despair and surprise. With that, the villainess contorts herself all over the floor, explaining that she used jutsus to conceal the toads. At that exact instant, we discover that dozens of green amphibians are spying on the girl from the ceiling. Then, the killer orders the young man to remain completely motionless and allow himself to be defeated to save her. Just then, the protagonist lets out a sarcastic laugh, commenting that using hostages is a tired old tactic. With that, the dark-haired youth challenges his opponent with a confident gaze, telling him to go right ahead and attack. At that moment, the villain widens his red eyes, thoroughly surprised by the young man's tremendous audacity. Then the creature grits its teeth in fury upon realizing that the dark-haired youth showed zero panic. Just then, the rival screams in irritation, believing that it is nothing but a bluff, and activates the command for the toads. With that, the enemy points his finger and furiously orders his creatures to attack the dark-haired youth instead. Just then, the terrible monster with the reddish gaze screams for his creatures to rip out his organs. With that, dozens of sharp red tongues charge in the young man's direction in a lethal strike. At that moment, the villain is startled to realize that the young man moved at high speed and vanished. Then, the enemy stands in disbelief, finding it impossible for the dark-haired youth to react with a hostage in danger. Just then, the hero strikes his rival with a violent punch that sends his mask flying far away. With that, the wounded monster begins to spit blood, and the protagonist glares at him in a serious manner. At that exact instant, the young man pierces his adversary's neck with his pen, causing heavy bleeding. But the rival's body suddenly detonates in a dense cloud of purple smoke that blankets the area. Then we see a small, injured, lifeless green toad lying on the blood-stained office floor. Just then, the dark-haired youth holds the dead amphibian, understanding that his opponent used a substitution trick. With that, the story explains that this ancient technique allows one to swap places with an object. At that moment, we learn that this trick serves as a true emergency escape route. Thus, we discover that swapping positions with a living being requires a massive amount of spiritual mastery. Just then, we understand that the villain's trick is an advanced jutsu, exclusive to those who control beasts. With that, the protagonist casts the animal aside and comments that he managed to evade the hit effortlessly. At that instant, the enemy grits his teeth in pure rage, his cheeks scratched from the battle. But the killer screams furiously from the ceiling, saying that the young man is heavily underestimating his abilities. Then the villain performs hand signs at high speed to conjure his absolute worst secret technique. Just then, the rival insanely orders his beasts to begin tearing the hero's neighbor to pieces. With that, the scenario displays the cute red-haired girl in her room as the venomous toads drop toward her. At that moment, the creatures leap hungrily, but his orange-haired ally acts quickly to save her. Thus, we discover that his red-haired friend was already infiltrated at the location, ready to halt the attack. Just then, the orange-haired warrior activates his smoke style, creating rapid clones that break into the apartment. With that, the gaseous copies begin striking down every single venomous toad, protecting the young lady. At that instant, the amphibians are crushed one by one, splashing blood and smoke against the wall. Then, the hooded hero finalizes the rescue while the neighbor stares at the situation, blushing. Just then, the red-haired youth smokes his electronic cigarette on the pole, thinking that he would never forgive anyone who harms girls. With that, the hooded youth strikes a stylish pose and promises to protect the red-haired girl in absolute silence. At that moment, the young warrior smiles proudly, thinking to himself that everything went exactly as his friend planned. Then, the story flashes back in time, showing when the two allies were conversing on the rooftop. Just then, the hooded red-haired youth gets startled upon learning that his companion plans to face the villain all alone. With that, the protagonist replies calmly, asserting that he will manage to handle the situation. At that exact instant, the dark-haired youth explains that there is a 90% chance of the rival utilizing attacks. He deduces that the killer's standard tactic would be to attack the school and the house at the exact same time. Then we return to the present, where the ally advises over the communicator that the neighbor is completely safe. Just then, the hooded youth keeps keeping an eye on the window, admiring the stretches she is doing. With that, he becomes completely mesmerized, commenting that she is simply a goddess. At that moment, the red-haired youth gets hearts in his eyes, dying of jealousy over his partner. Then, inside the office, the protagonist seriously advises his rival that his plan involving the hostages has failed. At that, the orange-haired monster is left completely speechless upon realizing that he has lost. With that, the hero unleashes his immense golden mystical aura and asserts that the plan was thoroughly naive. At that instant, the creature screams in fury and leaps from the ceiling to pierce the young man no matter what. But the dark-haired youth counterattacks with extreme speed, slicing his adversary's claws away with his pen. Then, the blue-eyed warrior mocks his rival, saying that his strike is weak and thoroughly predictable. Just then, the hero pierces yet another one of the gigantic toads with a precise hit that splatters blood. With that, the killer backs away in fear, crawling back to the safety of the ceiling. At that exact instant, the young man prepares himself, holding several pens, while thinking about his relationship with his neighbor. Then he recalls when the red-haired girl would cutely yawn while brushing her teeth in the morning before school. Just then, the young lady would ask him in a spoiled manner to buy low-fat milk on his way back. With that, the gorgeous girl would smile sweetly, asking the young man not to be long because she would worry. Just then, the protagonist manages to strike his adversary with precision, making the enemy scream in agony. With that, the hero remembers his neighbor's request with affection and feels his mystical aura burn brightly. At that moment, the bizarre villain hangs upside down from the ceiling, trying to distance himself. Then the warrior admits to himself that receiving that cute concern wasn't bad at all. Just then, the red-eyed killer falls into complete panic and screams for the dark-haired youth to stop. With that, the young man makes his final decision, wishing only to end the fight so he can go buy her milk. At that instant, the hero charges forward with all of his destructive speed, vowing to end the fight. But suddenly, the contorted monster flashes an extremely terrifying and macabre smile. Then the dark-haired youth, who was preparing his decisive blow, is struck by a wave of dread and freezes. Just then, the young man realizes in shock that his muscles have locked up, deducing that he has been poisoned. With that, the enemy hanging from the ceiling scoffs, laughing out loud upon noticing that the protagonist stopped. At that instant, the sharp-clawed assassin ironically asks if the hero wants an explanation. Then the bizarre-looking rival mocks the dark-haired youth, asking who exactly is the weak and pathetic one now. Just then, the monster cackles upside down, proclaiming that the true power of his poison is just beginning. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, the beautiful red-haired... At that moment, the dark-haired youth tries to react, but realizes in shock that his muscles are completely locked up right there. Just then, the terrible red-eyed enemy cackles upside down, noticing the hero's struggle to breathe. With that, the young man feels a wave of heavy dizziness as his vision begins to blur right in the middle of the office. At that exact instant, the youth stares into the void, wondering if he really was poisoned by his adversary. Then the hero's body plummets heavily onto the office floor, kicking up a small cloud of dust right there. Still, the protagonist laments on the floor that he failed to sense any substance approaching. Right then, the villain mocks him from way up on the ceiling, commenting that the warrior has lost all of his tough posture. With that, the slender monster lands on the floor right beside the fallen dark-haired youth, displaying his frightening appearance up close. At that moment, the creature holds a syringe filled with a green liquid and proclaims victory against our hero. Then, the legend explains that ancient ninjas used the wind's own smoke to suffocate their rivals. Those warriors of the past would burn toxic plants to destroy their opponent's lungs. Just then, a powerful general clad in red armor used venomous jellyfish to weaken the army. With that, the dark-haired youth recalls that he knew the dangers of the air, but still failed to avoid the trap. At that instant, the blue-eyed young man stares at a corner of the room, trying to decipher the origin of that attack. So he focuses his exhausted gaze straight toward the top of the cabinet, where the aquarium filled with little fish sits. Sure enough, inside that glass, the blue marine plants are beginning to release a strange purple mist. Right then, the corals expel glowing bubbles into the water, spreading the lethal toxin all across the office. With that, the assassin approaches with a laugh, asking if the boy honestly thought he only controlled amphibians. At that moment, the story reveals that the villain's secret weapon is a coral carrying the most dangerous toxin in the world. Thus, we discover that this marine plant is 8,000 times more potent than ordinary cyanide itself. Moreover, the monster confesses that he used his jutsus to release the poison very slowly so that no one would notice. Right then, the chemical formula of palatoxin is revealed, being one of the greatest threats created by science. With that, we see a scientist in a special hazmat suit, isolating the dangerous substance inside a laboratory. At that exact instant, the evolutionary lineage shows how humanity mastered this biology in 50 years. Then the dark-haired youth extends his weakened hand, realizing that this poison has absolutely no color or scent. But he reflects on how the ninjas of the past have evolved their secret techniques to an absurd degree in the present. Just then, the new warriors of the shadows utilize modern weapons blended with their traditional jutsus. With that, the assassin smiles in a sadistic manner, asserting that he possesses strengths that have never existed before. At that moment, the opponent steps with his high heel right onto the hand of the hero, who remains fallen on the floor. Then the villain strikes a bizarre pose and mockingly asks if the young man cannot manage to move even a single finger. However, the protagonist swallows hard, mentally admitting that his rival's terrible analysis is correct. Right then, the dark-haired youth stares at the glowing syringe, knowing that if he is struck by it, it will be his definitive end. With that, the adversary warns him up close that the powerful hero will be the perfect test subject for his experiment. At that instant, the monster raises his arm with the syringe, preparing the fatal strike under the window light. Then the dark-haired youth widens his eyes upon realizing that the creature is about to do something totally unexpected. But instead of attacking the young man, the villain plunges the needle hard right into his very own neck there. Just then, the massive needle pierces the opponent's skin, injecting the entire mysterious compound straight into his veins. With that, the hero stares at the scene in absolute shock, failing to understand the reason why he did that right there. At that moment, the rival's neck begins to change color, and bright red veins cover his skin. Then, the young man spots his opponent, picking up an ancient mystical scroll with his energy-filled hand. However, the assassin unrolls the mystic scroll in midair, releasing a dark and exceptionally heavy aura into the office. Right then, the dark-haired youth recognizes that ancient object and begins to sweat in dread upon seeing the paper floating. With that, the enemy envelops himself in the mystical paper, saying he is going to test the secret book of poisons. At that instant, the hero grows desperate as he recalls the legend surrounding that ominous scroll. He remembers the legendary one-eyed warrior who utilized this exact same technique in the distant past. But the villain begins to perform hand signs while the object glows all around him with immense power. Just then, massive blue lightning bolts blanket the entire area, emanating an absurd amount of chakra from right there. With that, the sheet wraps itself around the adversary's arm, channeling all the electricity of that energy. At that moment, the opponent's body begins to undergo a bizarre mutation, taking on a monstrous shape. Then the villain's hand transforms into a destructive purple claw that glows with a mystical flame. At that moment, the rival reveals that his ultimate poison has completely fused with his ninja skills. Right then, the creature flashes an eerie, hideous smile, placing full confidence in the immense power of the grimoire. With that, the opponent advances toward the fallen hero, who remains motionless on the floor, unable to move from right there. At that instant, the monster steps into the purple liquid on the floor with a laugh, asking if the boy is going to completely melt away. Then the villain's heel slams with extreme force into the acidic puddle, generating a massive splash of the substance. But the creature raises his hand, covered in toxic sludge, wondering to himself if his opponent will turn into nothing but a puddle. Right then, the villain leaps fiercely from the ceiling, wanting to see the young ninja's terrible final moment. With that, the assassin's 4 monstrous hands advance all at once, ready to crush the hero's head. At that moment, the creature collides with the dark-haired youth, restraining the young man with all the strength of his extra arms. Then the monster widens his red eyes in absolute panic upon noticing that the young man's body is boiling. But a massive explosion of hot steam throws the villain backward, saving the protagonist from that tight spot. Just then, the enemy is left totally perplexed and confused, failing to understand how the boy managed to react like that. With that, the dark-haired youth remains stretched out on the floor, while an immense amount of smoke radiates from his body. At that instant, the exhausted young man realizes that those centuries of ninja history have brought forth highly dangerous techniques. Then, the 4-armed villain stares at the scene, quite startled by his opponent's strange reaction. But the hero flashes a brief smile on the floor, commenting that not even he was aware of this kind of mystical technique. Right then, the monster rises back up, huffing, and wonders if their fallen mystical leader would have anything to say about that scene. With that, the dark-haired youth's mind visualizes the ancient warrior Nobunaga, smiling with absolute derision at the enemy. At that moment, the assassin stares at the corner of the room, shaking from the heat as he notices something bizarre in the environment. Then the water inside the large aquarium begins to boil intensely, creating bubbles due to the extreme temperature. But the villain begins to sweat in dread, comparing the heat of that room to a literal steam sauna. Just then, a small toad sitting on the monster's head begins to shrivel up due to the extreme heat of the place. With that, dozens of green amphibians plummet dried and lifeless from the ceiling directly onto the opponent's shoulders. At that instant, the creature falls into utter despair upon noticing that his beloved pets have perished. Then the villain holds one of his toads and realizes in horror that the animal has shriveled up like a raisin. But the monster reasons in terror, understanding that his opponent's temperature is rising without stopping. Right then, the hero continues to glow intensely in a vivid bright red shade, while the floor all around him melts. With that, the dark-haired youth challenges his rival, shouting to see which of the 2 techniques is the true victor there. At that moment, the venomous corals inside the aquarium boil and end up destroyed by the immense heat of the room. Then, the assassin swallows hard, startled by the complete destruction of his primary source of toxins. But the water in the container bubbles violently, evaporating all the moisture from that sealed office. Right then, the rival tries to breathe with great difficulty, sensing that the air is as hot as fire itself. With that, the opponent leaps in a fury, asserting that the dark-haired youth's reaction is nothing but a useless effort. At that instant, the red-eyed monster is shocked to realize that the boy has completely vanished from his sight. Then, the villain looks in every direction in absolute panic, finding it impossible for the young man to have left that spot so quickly. But the hero reappears standing right behind his rival, emanating a powerful blue aura of pure mystical energy. Just then, the assassin falls to his knees on the floor, trembling, staring at the dark-haired youth with a look of complete dread and astonishment. With that, the youth with the glowing blue eyes glares fixedly at the monster from above with an imposing stance. At that moment, the opponent realizes in horror that the boy managed to completely burn all the poison out of his body. Then, the story explains how the dark-haired youth managed to vibrate every single one of his muscles to save himself from the toxin. The young man used his perfect energy control to activate his organism's most basic defense mechanism. Right then, sweat is revealed as the human body's primary natural tool for expelling any poison. With that, the dark-haired youth utilized his mystical jutsus to accelerate the vibration of his fibers to the absolute maximum right there. At that instant, each part of his electric body generated an immense physical friction that heated his blood. Then the hero shielded his most vital internal organs, lining the walls of his heart with chakra. But this process caused his body temperature to spike like a microwave running on high. Right then, the dark-haired youth expelled all of the assassin's toxin through his skin, feeling totally rejuvenated once again. With that, the young man's body temperature reaches the absurd level of 120 degrees under his rival's gaze. At that moment, the villain screams in terror, realizing that the hero's sweat evaporates immediately upon touching the air. Then the creature focuses its gaze of pure hatred, resolved to use its final card against the formidable young man. At that moment, the villain charges forward in a fury, delivering dozens of rapid strikes with all of his arms. Just then, the youth performs a spectacular evasion, creating several illusions of himself to confuse his rival. With that, the monster's claws strike nothing but the wind, while the hero distances himself with great agility. At that instant, the dark-haired youth feels that the high temperature is causing severe dehydration in his body. Then, the opponent deduces in shock that any ordinary person would have already perished from such a massive loss of water. But the monster mocks him, asserting that the young man will not be able to endure and keep fighting for very long. Right then, the panting hero smiles, knowing he has only a single minute of full movement left to win. With that, the assassin lets out a sadistic laugh, planning to drag out the fight until his time runs out. At that moment, the enemy brings his hands together, preparing a new secret jutsu to guarantee his definitive victory. Then the opponent summons a gigantic venomous serpent that charges with its mouth wide open against the dark-haired youth. But the giant reptile moves at high speed, trying to swallow our protagonist without a single shred of mercy. Just then, a large explosion of purple poison blankets the area, seeming to engulf the young man's body all at once. With that, the villain transforms into a serpentine beast, believing he has secured victory in the combat. At that instant, the monster decides to back away to maintain his distance and wait for the poison's effect to return. Then, the enemy shatters the large glass window, leaping out of the building to flee from the hero's fury. But the dark-haired youth plants his feet firmly on the wet ground and sets off in pursuit of the creature at an impressive speed. Right then, the monster screams in pain upon being struck in midair by an extremely swift counterattack from the young man. With that, the adversary widens his eyes as he sees the hero advancing from below with overwhelming power. At that moment, the young man glows, enveloped in flames of pure energy, evaporating all the smoke all around. Then the dark-haired youth displays a lethal look, showing that he is ready to deliver the definitive blow from right there. But the enemy contorts in desperation, howling in pain due to the scorching heat radiating from the hero. Right then, waves of mystical heat rip through the opponent, causing his snake transformation to unravel. With that, the villain wonders in absolute panic what the true origin of that absurd technique could be. At that instant, the young man appears with gigantic wings of mystical smoke, blocking any possible escape route. Then, the assassin stares at the youth, realizing that this mystical power belongs to an entirely different era than this one. But the hero brings his fingers together, performing rapid signs that make the environment's energy vibrate powerfully. Just then, The story explains that the dark-haired youth's current physical structure is merely that of a normal student. Because of this, he was utilizing only 5% of his total chakra to avoid destroying his own muscles. At that moment, the young man discovered a new way to combat toxins amidst all that immense heat. Then, the mystical dark-haired youth channels his spiritual strength to purify every single blood vessel right there. But with the remaining 30%, he enhances his physical attributes to a superhuman level. Right then, the hero smiles with absolute confidence, knowing that his combat plan truly worked out right there. With that, an explosion of golden energy and lightning envelops the young man, illuminating the entire school courtyard. At that instant, the dark-haired youth assumes the legendary golden form of a mystical warrior with a fearless gaze. Then, the villain screams in complete shock upon noticing that the young man has transformed into that legend of the past. Moreover, the legend reveals that the boy's golden appearance is identical to that of the strongest shinobi in history. Right then, the hero descends from the heavens like a true mystical thunderbolt, generating a massive spiritual pressure. With that, the warrior advances like a golden flash, utterly impossible for his rival to track with the naked eye. At that instant, the monster tries to defend himself, but is completely overwhelmed by the destructive brilliance from right there. Then, the young man delivers a devastating mystical strike that hits the villain's chest, sending purple liquid splashing. However, the adversary is hurled with extreme force through the air, feeling that his energy has been totally depleted. Right then, the enemy begins to spit dark smoke while falling defeated toward the school ground. With that, the assassin's disfigured body plummets from above, falling with absolutely no strength left to continue. At that moment, the villain crashes heavily against the asphalt, kicking up dust and fragments of stone. Then the legendary hero lands in an imposing manner right beside the fallen monster, who merely groans in pain. But the blonde young man with the glowing eyes confirms his true identity, leaving his opponent completely frozen. Just then, the mystical warrior smiles victoriously upon declaring that the mission to capture his rival is concluded. With that, the villain's deactivated body rolls across the school courtyard, totally defeated by the power of gold. At that instant, the legendary young man with the blonde hair stares at his defeated opponent with a firm and calm look. Then the hero walks back into the shadows, knowing that he has fulfilled his duty and brought peace to the city. At that moment, the defeated villain on the ground admits that the young man's power is formidable, but says his time has run out. Right then, the opponent grits his teeth and mockingly warns that the mystical hero ended up arriving far too late right there. With that, the monster flashes a sneering smile, saying that his work of spreading chaos has been completed. At that instant, the creature asserts that the entire country will soon completely collapse into chaos. Then the assassin widens his red eyes and says goodbye, telling the dark-haired youth to go to hell once and for all. But the monster's mouth glows in a strange manner, revealing that he possesses a mystical pill right within his teeth. Just then, the blonde youth with the blue eyes notices that his rival hid a lethal dose of poison right inside his molar tooth. With that, the mystical hero refuses to let his opponent escape and prepares to deliver another punch. At that moment, the young man with the golden fist strikes his rival's chin, preventing him from biting down on the dangerous pill. Then, the venomous tooth goes flying away, and the assassin passes out for good, completely incapable of fighting right there. Still, the blonde protagonist stares at his unconscious adversary, saying that he has many questions to ask him. Right then, the opponent's body bleeds on the ground, while the dark-haired youth in his mystical form stares at the surrounding damage. With that, the golden aura unravels and the hero returns to his student appearance, wiping the sweat from his face. At that instant, the young man walks away tiredly, admitting that severe dehydration almost cost him his life in the combat. Then, the dark-haired youth goes to the school's outdoor area during the sunset, desperately searching for water. The boy begins to drink hastily directly from a courtyard faucet to recover quickly. Just then, cold drops stream down the neck of the hero, who keeps drinking plenty of water to hydrate himself right there. With that, the young man reflects on the previous battle, admitting that this toxin user was exceptionally strong. At that moment, he knows that if he had made a single mistake during the fight, the defeated one would have been himself right there. Then, the young man turns off the metal faucet and leans against the stone counter, thinking about what he must do now. But the protagonist flashes a subtle smile, knowing that despite the difficulties, the victory was his in the end. Right then, the dark-haired youth feels relieved after drinking the fresh water and recovers all of his energy for the mission. With that, the scene stares at the dusk while a telephone call requires a secret ninja password. At that instant, the young man answers with the code over his phone, and the union's central office requests that he state his business. Then the hero advises that he managed to capture the Toad Killer alive and reveals his exact location. However, the dark-haired youth hangs up the phone and stands waiting for the team's backup to arrive to collect the prisoner. Just then the boy hears a loud noise of exploding earth right behind him and spins around, startled in the courtyard. With that, a massive ninja clad in golden armor emerges, digging through the school's asphalt as backup from the Union. At that moment, the armored giant approaches the dark-haired youth, commenting that the target was indeed taken alive. Then the Grand Warrior gathers the unconscious rival, while the young man thanks the team for their help from right there. But the armored ally pulls out a small green tube and unscrews the cap with his hands in a highly careful manner. Right then, the giant points the object toward the prisoner, advising that he is going to use a gas to put him to sleep. With that, the sleeping gas is sprayed directly onto the fallen villain's face, guaranteeing that he will not wake up anytime soon. At that instant, the Grand Warrior seals his mystical vial, leaving his opponent totally defenseless. Then, the mystical giant advises that the team will handle the entire interrogation of their rival inside headquarters. Meanwhile, the dark-haired youth reflects in silence that the ninja group possesses various specialists across diverse fields. Just then, the story displays the secret transport team, which is professional at smuggling classified cargo. With that, another cleanup crew scales the school wall to erase every single trace of destruction. At that moment, the assistants dressed in black repair the broken glass window, cleaning up all the mess from right there. Then, the young man looks up, thinking to himself that concealing battles from the modern public is difficult work. But he decides to turn his back on the area, knowing he can leave that part of the mission for his allies to clean up. Right then, the dark-haired youth recalls his primary commitment and knows he needs to go buy milk for his neighbor soon. With that, the young man checks the demanding text messages on his phone and lets out a tired sigh. At that instant, a blue carton of milk and a package of chocolate protein powder are displayed on the table. Then, the beautiful red-haired girl drinks the fresh liquid in her glass, savoring every single sip after her yoga workout. But the young lady happily cheers, wiping her mouth upon seeing that the dark-haired youth finally brought her favorite beverage. Just then, the young man stares at his neighbor with an exhausted look, tired of being treated as nothing more than an ordinary delivery boy. With that, the red-haired girl drapes herself over the boy's back in an affectionate manner, saying she was deeply worried. At that moment, the hero complains of pain upon feeling the scratches on his arm caused by the previous combat. Then, the beautiful young lady with the red eyes stares closely at the dark-haired youth's face with a gaze full of mystery and sweetness. At that moment, the red-eyed young lady stares at the young man, asking if he suffered some kind of mistreatment again. With that, the dark-haired youth is quite surprised while resting his injured arm in the kitchen. Then, the girl sits cross-legged on the floor, wearing comfortable workout clothes. But the young man flashes an awkward smile, claiming that he merely ended up tripping on the way back. Right then, the moonlight shines intensely over the big city's buildings, illuminating the entire region. At that moment, a delicious traditional Japanese meal featuring various dishes is served on the table. With that, the hero begins to eat in silence while his neighbor accompanies him closely. Then, the young man thinks to himself that his primary duty against that dangerous villain has already been resolved. But he remembers the monster's terrible threat, saying that the entire country would soon collapse. Just then, the youth stares at his plate thoughtfully, wondering what exactly that enemy meant to say. At that moment, he wonders if there truly is a secret organization operating behind everything. With that, the young man recalls the mysterious scroll and wonders if other attacks are bound to happen. Then the hero remembers that the mystical object is identical to the one used by the ninja who defeated Nobunaga. However, a powerful sensation of imminent danger consumes the mind of the boy with the glowing blue eyes. Just then, he clenches his fist tightly, sensing that something terrible is exceptionally close to happening. At that instant, the red-haired girl in her kitchen apron stares at the dark-haired youth, asking if something tastes bad. With that, the hero gets startled and quickly replies with his chopsticks in hand that everything is excellent. Then the girl lets out a suspicious sigh, not entirely believing her neighbor's excuse. But she warns him in a protective manner that if anyone strikes him again, he must let her know without hesitation. Just then, the young lady with the red eyes points her chopstick, resolved to defend her friend from any rival. At that moment, the protagonist stares at her finger pointed in his direction, left completely without a reaction. With that, he silently thanks the girl for her support while reflecting on Hibari's past. Then the neighbor goes back to eating cheerfully, stuffing her cheeks with food in absolute cuteness. But the young man knows that he needs to protect that special person at any cost from all danger. Right then, the hero reflects that the previous owner of that body must have been a timid and frightened boy. At that exact instant, he recalls that the old owner suffered so much at school that he tried to give up on everything. With that, the warrior focuses his determined gaze, knowing that the true Hibari will one day return. Therefore, he wishes that this incredibly kind neighbor remains right by that boy's side forever. But the red-haired girl interrupts his thoughts, offering more food in a highly spontaneous manner. Just then, she flashes a beautiful smile, claiming victory for having used a special seasoning in the recipe. At that moment, the two share a knowing and cheerful look in the middle of that warm meal. With that, the young man notices that the feeling that now unites them at the table is the purest form of peace. Then, the protagonist concludes his train of thought with a firm decision regarding his current role. Afterward, the young man lies down on the comfortable bed of his dark bedroom, looking at the ceiling thoughtfully. Just then, he understands that his single true mission from now on is to keep that routine safe. At that exact instant, the hero sits on the edge of the bed under the soft illumination coming from the open window. With that, he pulls aside the blue fabric curtain, focused entirely on protecting that home from any threat. Then the dark-haired youth observes the massive full moon in the sky, promising to unmask all of his enemies. Moreover, an aura of absolute determination arises in his gaze, resolved to crush all intruders in the city. Just then, a mysterious purple-haired female ninja appears silently, affectionately embracing him from behind. At that moment, the beautiful intruder with black nails whispers provocatively right next to his ear. With that, the young man widens his eyes in shock for failing to sense that assassin's presence right there. Then, he reacts quickly, firmly gripping the intruder's arm to prevent any strike. But the dark-haired youth glares at her with a serious look, questioning where she came from and how she managed to enter the bedroom. Just then, the dark-haired girl licks her red lips mockingly, completely ignoring the question. At that instant, she utilizes an exceptionally swift escape technique, dissolving like smoke into the air. With that, the hero is left completely perplexed to note that the enemy escaped from his hands. Then, the assassin reappears sitting on the young man's bed in a confident manner, displaying a calm smile. But the youth with the blue eyes stares at his opponent, wondering what the true goal of that visit could be. Right then, the female ninja begins to remove her combat cloak to initiate a new battle against the dark-haired youth. At that moment, the dangerous girl draws close, whispering in a provocative manner that leaves him quite embarrassed. With that, a young man with red hair emerges from the middle of the smoke, revealing that she is a ninja too. Then, the hooded ally advises that he came to fetch the young lady because of a highly urgent summon. He reveals that the prisoner of the shadows has finally decided to speak about the entire truth of that mission. Just then, the dark-haired youth stands completely shocked, realizing that he will finally have the answers he sought so desperately. At that exact instant, the group walks toward the warrior's massive secret Union base under the moonlight. With that, the red-haired youth questions his female companion's presence, and she merely replies that she was bored. Then, a little white-haired girl with a small mouse on her head appears, welcoming the group. But the two combatants bow in a sign of deep respect upon seeing the important leader right before them. Just then, the protagonist stares at the small animal on the young girl's head, left rather confused by that scene. At that moment, the leader guides everyone down the dark corridor, passing through the heavy iron bars right there. With that, the little one lights a candle to illuminate the path toward the location's underground dungeons. Then, the prisoner with long orange hair is seen chained to the wall of that cold cell. But the small leader approaches with the candle and orders the villain to tell everything he knows about the mysteries. Just then, the tiny pet fish stares at the prisoner, waiting for him to reveal the secret of the scroll. At that exact instant, the enemy remains completely silent with his head lowered, showing zero reaction. With that, he finally raises his face, displaying his frightening black eyes in the middle of the darkness. Then the hero realizes immediately that his adversary is under the effect of a powerful hypnosis jutsu, but the monster begins to speak in a trance, revealing that this object is the legendary grimoire of the shinobis. Just then, the dark-haired youth is shocked to finally discover the true name of that mysterious floating paper. At that moment, the villain reveals that 9 scrolls exist, and his group already possesses 3 of them. With that, the leader questions if they are collecting the objects, and the rival confirms the suspicion. Then, the protagonist requests permission to ask questions, but the girl advises him to act with care. However, the dark-haired youth ignores the danger and asks who the secret organization commanding all those attacks is. Just then, the hero questions what the group's true objective is, and if the man in the one-eyed mask belongs to them. At that exact instant, the prisoner's countenance shifts drastically upon hearing the young warrior's questions. With that, the young man stares closely at the enemy, waiting anxiously for the revelation of that leader's name. Then, the villain begins to groan in pain while his body suffers due to a terrible mystical seal inside his mind. But he lets out a deafening shriek of agony, pulling at the chains with all of his physical strength from right there. Just then, the hooded red-haired youth backs away, quite startled upon noticing that his opponent is thrashing intensely. At that moment, the leader advises that one of the dark-haired youth's questions triggered a dangerous security lock. With that, the allies look on in surprise, failing to understand the gravity of that terrible situation in the dungeon. Then, the little girl explains that this mental lock normally forces the person to take their own life, but the rival continues to resist the seal of death, solely due to his immense vital strength. Just then, the small leader stares at the dark-haired youth, highly impressed by the boy's power in the previous battle. At that exact instant, she comments that it is incredible for the young man to have defeated such a resilient and dangerous opponent. With that, the chained villain continues to contort himself while attempting to fight against the seal in his mind. Then, he finally reveals in a trance that the name of his terrible secret organization is Akegarasu. But the monster screams that their plan is to gather all the grimoires to completely destroy the current peace of Japan. Just then, he asserts with hatred that he is going to drag the entire country straight back to the bloody era of wars. At that moment, the hero stands completely perplexed upon hearing the revelation of that villainous group's plans. With that, the earth begins to shake violently, startling all the ninjas inside that dungeon. Then, the purple-haired girl falls into despair, failing to understand what is happening inside the headquarters. But a massive explosion strikes the location, destroying the stone walls and spreading fire through everything. Just then, the youth with the blue eyes senses the danger and enters a state of maximum alert with a surprise attack. At that instant, the young man screams for everyone to flee immediately before the ceiling collapses over them. With that, the group runs desperately down the corridor, attempting to escape the collapsing stones. Then the hero's mind recalls the villain's words about bringing back that terrible era of wars. But he realizes that the prisoner only answered the questions because that terrible lock was triggered. Just then, the dark-haired youth understands in shock that the explosion was caused by the seal protecting the leader's identity. At that moment, the dark-haired youth spots a mysterious silhouette observing everything from the top of a massive cliff. With that, the youth with the glowing blue eyes grows extremely furious upon recognizing the rival's presence. Then he recalls an ancient warrior of the past who possessed that exact same prominent mark in his life. But the terrible masked villain stares at the horizon from high above, displaying a highly imposing stance. Just then, the protagonist grinds his teeth in deep hatred upon realizing that he has finally found his despised rival. At that exact instant, the group of enemies from the shadows emerges from high above, revealing that they belong to the dangerous organization. With that, the man in the one-eyed mask declares that he came to rescue his ally who was held inside the cell. Then the hero's allies begin to break into a cold sweat upon noticing that every single opponent there is far too strong. But the invading group emanates an exceptionally heavy purple aura, looking like true monsters from another dimension. Just then, the red-haired warrior yells out in irritation, knowing that those villains were hidden this entire time. At that moment, the flames consume the base, revealing their malicious plan to bring back the era of wars. With that, the hooded youth is left unable to understand the true reason why they wish to destroy that nation's peace. Then a massive explosion hurls stones in every direction, forcing the allies to retreat in a hurry. But the dark-haired youth advances at an absurd speed, delivering a devastating kick against the masked force of evil. Just then, the allies shout in surprise upon seeing the young man attacking the terrible enemy without a single second thought. At that instant, the protagonist releases his blue energy, vowing to defeat the despised masked figure right then and there. With that, the mystical warrior lets out a powerful battle cry, focused solely on his personal vengeance. Then, the muscular opponent remains completely calm with his arms crossed, awaiting the blow. But the one-eyed villain moves rapidly, gathering a dark energy inside his combat claws. Just then, the terrible red eye of his mask glows with intensity, revealing an immense dark power.